The young man looked intently at his companion and asked what had happened to her. He smiled and asked if she was nervous. The young lady looked at him timidly but did not answer. The young lady came closer to him and timidly asked if nothing would happen after he chose her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he swears that he will definitely protect her. He smiled and asked her to be happy with him. He asked if she promised him this. The young lady smiled. She was very pleased to hear such a thing. She hoped that they would be happy together. One of the maids pushed the girl, and she accidentally broke a plate. A moment later, the maid pushed the girl, and she fell with a crash. The maids were making fun of the girl. The head maid entered the room and asked in bewilderment what had happened. The maids told the head maid that Agnes was to blame for everything. The head maid was furious, as the girl was nothing but trouble. She came closer to her and looked at her with fury. The rest of the maids were watching everything that was happening intently. The maids on the side were mocking Agnes, and the girl in turn was trembling with fear and did not know what to answer. The head maid was furious. She looked at the girl and told her to go and clean immediately. Agnes sighed heavily and agreed with her. She was glad that she was not punished. The head maid looked at the girl with disdain and told her to clean up immediately. The head maid said with disdain that the young girl was lucky that the master had picked her up. Agnes ran down the corridor in a hurry. She was in a lot of pain. Everyone said that she was empty. As a child, she lost all her memories. She walked wherever her eyes looked. She was on the verge of death, but she was picked up. The maid looked at Agnes and told her to help her clean the garden. The maid said that it was very cold outside today, and also asked if she still didn't feel the cold. Agnes said with a sad look that it was so. Her companion did not answer. The maids whispered behind her back and said that she looked like a doll. They said that she was a ghost doll with long hair. Agnes walked slowly about her business, lost in her thoughts, not noticing anything around her. But a moment later, she accidentally collided with the young lady. Agnes was in shock. The maids were laughing at Agnes on the sidelines. They were anticipating what would happen next, because they knew that Agnes would not have it easy now. Lady Carla looked at the maid with anger and fury. She did not understand how she dared to do something like that. A moment later, Agnes fell to the floor, tears in her eyes, screaming at the young lady that she was terribly sorry. Agnes was very scared because she knew that the lady might beat her again. Lady Carla came closer to her and asked if Agnes thought she would forgive her if she bowed before her. Lady Carla angrily kicked the maid in the face, causing Agnes to bleed. The lady shouted at the maid that she was a doll without memory, and it seemed that she had completely forgotten about good manners towards her mistress. The lady screamed at the maids that she was a dirty rat and that her mere presence nearby was enough to dirty the mansion. Agnes, in turn, wanted it all to end quickly, but the young lady did not want to let her go like that. She took a bucket of water and said with a grin that she could help her wash herself while she poured cold water on the maid. The lady asked the maid if she thought she had become a little cleaner. Agnes, in turn, wanted everything to stop. She thanked the lady without raising her head. Lady Carla said angrily that she didn't even know how to cry, and that was simply disgusting. She said that as soon as her father gave her permission, she would throw her out that very minute. Agnes, in turn, was glad that she left. Agnes worked slowly outside. It was very hard and bad for her, as she was wet and chilled. She felt cold and pain, but she knew she couldn't show it. She knew that the master had saved her and given her a job in his mansion. She didn't care that this place looked like hell. She knew she could withstand anything. Looking at the weather outside the window, the maids whispered and said that it looked like the night would be very cold. The maid looked at the head maid and said that Agnes was acting very strangely. The maid said that Agnes had been cleaning the garden and was soaking wet and freezing, but I said that the girl deserved it. The head maid told the maid to leave her, as she didn't want anyone else to get infected. The head maid said she didn't care what happened to the girl, who didn't even know where she came from. Agnes was shaking from cold and pain, asking him for someone to help her. Agnes found it difficult to breathe, but a moment later she saw a light, reminding her of her past when she tried to reach out for help. She fell into the abyss and wondered when it happened. Memories came flooding back to her, and she saw the mansion burning in flames, and her parents. The young girl was trembling with fear. She screamed and called for her parents, but all was in vain. The young girl ran hurriedly to her mother with tears in her eyes. She ran up to her mother and, falling down next to her, asked her to wake up. She screamed and called for someone to help. She couldn't believe that all this was happening to them. Her mother reached out to her and told her not to cry. The lady hugged her daughter and asked her to live and definitely find her happiness. She looked at her daughter with tender eyes and, with a smile on her face, asked her to live for them. Agnes woke up early in the morning. She was a little puzzled by what she had dreamed. She noticed that she had overslept, but when she touched her head, she found that her temperature had dropped. She was glad that she was feeling better, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw that her eye color had changed. She was confused because she realized that she had seen red eyes in her dream. She didn't understand what it meant. Some time later, the maids were whispering happily to each other. Looking out the window, they saw the Duke's carriage. They smiled and said that a messenger had arrived to see them. The maids were happily rejoicing and wondering whether their young lady would really be proposed to. They said that if everything went well, the Wilfrid family would be safe. Agnes overheard their conversation. She, in turn, was very happy that she already felt better. She was surprised because yesterday's scar on her cheek from the lady's blows had disappeared the next morning. She was confused and didn't understand what was going on at all. But a moment later she remembered a strange dream. She didn't understand why she had it. The lady, in turn, was very happy since the Duke's messenger had arrived, and soon she would be proposed to. She was very happy and wondered who her future husband was. The young lady, in turn, was burning with curiosity. She wanted to find out about everything as soon as possible. As she passed by, she noticed a maid who was carefully washing the floor. She decided that she just needed to kill time until the news came. She approached the maid and said with a grin that she seemed to be safe. Agnes shuddered as she was very afraid of her mistress. Lady Carla said with a grin that she had heard that Agnes had a fever and nearly died. The maid, in turn, understood that she would be hurt again. She was trembling with fear. The lady looked at her and said that since she was alive, she had business with her. Some time later, the young lady took the maid and they went to the vault. She pushed the maid inside with a smirk. The lady looked at the maid and said that it would be ugly if such a dirty rat as she showed herself to the guests. Lady Carla said, with a grin, that her job was to sit indoors for quiet time. Lady Carla closed the door, and Agnes was left in the dark and damp room. As she left, she said with a smile that she looked like she was able to kill time after all. She knew she had to go and talk to her parents. Now she was glad she had been able to deal with the maid. Meanwhile, the maid was screaming and knocking on the door, asking someone to open the door. The young lady entered the room with a smile on her face and called her parents. She noticed that they were worried and very sad, but she still wanted to talk to them. The madam looked at her daughter and called her. The young lady smiled and said that the whole mansion was already discussing this topic. She asked if the messenger had come to propose to her. She noticed that her parents were not in the mood. She looked at them with bewilderment. Her father said she was right, and the messenger brought a letter from the Duke. Looking at his daughter, he said that he had sent her asking for the hand and heart of the daughter of the Wilfrid family. The young lady was very happy about this. She looked at her mother with a smile and asked if she was now the Duke's wife. The young lady looked at her mother in bewilderment and asked what had happened. Her father looked at her and told her to sit down, as he wanted to talk about marriage. He said that Duke Gilbert had asked for her hand Dedric's, who was a powerful man in the Eastern Kingdom. The young lady froze in fear. She was shocked by what she heard. She knew that the Duke was very mysterious and rarely showed himself in high society. Countless girls married him, but they all met a sad fate. Each and every one of them died mysteriously within a couple of months of their wedding, which is why he was nicknamed the Deadly Duke. The young lady was furious. She screamed that she didn't want to marry him. She screamed that she didn't want to die. Without looking at her parents, she asked what she had done to them that was so bad that they wanted to send her to him. The madam looked at her husband and said that their daughter had recently come of age, and it would be too cruel to marry her off to the deadly duke. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything, and therefore he did not intend to marry his daughter to the duke. He said he would be glad to refuse, but rumor had it that everyone who opposed him was killed, and Madame said he was simply a terrible person. The young lady looked at her father and asked if he was going to sacrifice her for the sake of their family. He looked at his daughter and asked her not to cry. He said he already had a backup plan. The head maid looked at the maid, who was shivering from the cold, and told her to go out as the master wanted to see her. The head maid told the master that she had brought Agnes, and the maid looked at him in bewilderment. Carla looked at her father and asked angrily what the dirty maid was doing there. Looking at the maid, he said that she was the duke's bride, as she fully deserved it. Carla was in shock with tears in her eyes. She furiously asked her father what he was talking about. Madame looked at her husband and asked if this meant that the maid would become Carla. He approached the maid and said that her real name was Agnes Wilfrid, and that she was his brother's only daughter. He looked at her intently and said that she was his daughter, Wilfridoff, and the current bride of the Duke of Dedrix. Agnes looked at everyone present in surprise. She was perplexed. She did not understand what they were talking about. Carla looked at her father with fury and asked if he was really saying that your maid had Wilfrid blood. The madam looked at the maid in surprise and said that she could not believe that she was her niece. The count smiled and said that she was now his daughter. The young lady froze in bewilderment. He looked at everyone present and said that after the death of his younger brother, he, as the eldest, took her in as his adopted daughter, but due to circumstances, he had to treat her like a servant. The lady looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked why he did this. The count smiled and said that he would explain everything to them later, but now he wanted to talk to Agnes alone. The count looked at them and asked if they could go out. The young lady objected to her father. He looked at her with a stern gaze, and she became quiet as she was afraid of her father. He looked at them with fury and pointed to the door. He said that he hated it when his family did not listen to him. The lady looked at her daughter and gently said that it was time for them to go. Carla passed by Agnes and said furiously that she would never ever call her sister. Agnes was shocked and did not answer the young lady. He looked at Agnes intently and apologized for giving her this information like that. He looked at her and said that they needed to talk. Agnes looked at him intently and asked if he had really picked her up 7 years ago. She said that from then until now, she had been a servant in his house. He smiled and said that in order to protect her, he had to act this way. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at the young lady with a hard, complaining look and said that her parents had been killed by someone. The young lady was shocked by what she heard and asked what he was talking about. Now she realized that her dream was not just a dream, but her memory. He looked at her and said with a soft smile that he had hidden her because otherwise they would have hunted her. She asked if he meant to say that he had made her a servant in order to hide her from the murderers, since she had lost her memory and could not remember who she had been before. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was absolutely right in her thinking. The count smiled and said that now the time had finally come for her to regain her true self. The count asked if she would marry the deadly duke instead of Carla, as only she could play that role. The young lady was shocked to hear that he wanted her to marry the deadly duke. She remembered how the maids discussed the duke and said that any daughter of a nobleman who became his bride met with a quick death. The young lady asked in shock if she would really marry the lady and meet her death there. He smiled looking at his niece. He said that she was quite smart. The count stroked her head with a smile and said that it made him happy, and at the same time he called her a doll. He came closer to her and quietly said that it seemed that useless things were sometimes useful too. He looked at her and said that as a daughter of the Wilfrid family, she should be proud of herself and follow her parents. Agnes was shocked by what she heard. A moment later, the maid knocked on the door and said that the preparations were already completed. The man smiled as he looked at his niece and told her to back off and get ready for the wedding. He looked at the servants and said that Agnes must look worthy for the Duke's family. He looked at them intently and with a smile told them to immediately start making all the preparations. Some time later, the maids were busily preparing Agnes for the celebration. Agnes looked at them timidly and said that she could wash herself. The head maid said angrily that they could do nothing since it was the master's order. She looked closely at the young lady and told her not to disturb them while they worked. The head maid said that what was required of her was to be a doll until the very end. Agnes looked at them intently, but said nothing. She was bathed, her hair was brushed, and her makeup was applied, and she knew she had to put on a beautiful outfit. The head maid looked at her intently and said that dolls could be beautiful too, and from now on, no one in this house would call her a servant. The maids looked at the young lady and said that the carriage had arrived. The head maid looked at the young lady angrily and said goodbye. Some time later, all the servants said goodbye to the young lady. As she walked toward the door, she noticed Lady Carla, who kept her angry gaze fixed on her. Carla looked at the young lady intently and said that just because she had changed on the outside, it wouldn't change what was inside her. She said with a grin that she was sure she would be killed in less than a day. Carla said that at least somewhere the empty doll would be useful, since it would die in her place, and she should take that as an honor. She smirked and told Agnes to show her respect. A moment later, Agnes bowed to her. Carla was in shock. The man looked at his niece and said with a smile that she looked wonderful, and the Duke would be pleased with such a beautiful young lady. Agnes, in turn, did not answer, and slowly continued to kick the carriage. The messenger looked intently at the young lady. The man looked at the messenger and said that, as promised, he was giving away a daughter from his family, and she would marry the Duke. The messenger looked intently at the young lady and asked for her hand. The young lady walked slowly towards the carriage. She knew that she would never return to this mansion again. Agnes knew that no matter the reason the master had cared for her for many years, she knew that she should be the doll until the very end. Turning around, she slowly approached the gentleman. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, the young lady bowed to him and said goodbye. The man looked after her intently. He was very glad that everything turned out this way. The young lady, in turn, was trembling with fear. She knew that even if she was an empty doll, she was afraid. The butler looked at his master and said that the bride would arrive tomorrow. The butler said he had heard that the girl was the daughter of Earl Wilfrid. The Duke was shocked and wondered if he had learned nothing. He did not understand why he hated him so much. He sighed heavily and said that it did not matter who came to him, since any of his brides would soon die. Agnes and her sweet friend were having fun in a flower meadow, and the young man asked if she could stay. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had the same strength as her mother. She said that until she can use it, she is not allowed to be around people. She smiled looking at her friend and said that for this reason she spends all her time in the mansion. Agnes said she spends time with her parents and maids. She sighed heavily and said that she sometimes got bored. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she really wanted to go somewhere far from home. The young lady in turn smiled and said that she wanted to travel. She said that she had read about it in books, and it was written there that there were many beautiful and wonderful things in cities. She said that she definitely wanted to see the mountains and lakes because she liked all of it. The young man smiled and said that he would definitely go with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was sure about this. She said that her mother always told her that the streets in the city were very scary, and the young man said that he would definitely protect her from danger. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and said that it was true, and he made her a promise. He said that he would always protect her. He smiled and said that he wanted her smile to always remain with him. He smiled and asked why they couldn't stay together forever. The young lady in turn smiled and said that she agreed. The young lady woke up in the carriage. She sighed heavily, but was glad that she had a good dream. The man looked at the young lady and said that they were almost there. Agnes looked out the window, amazed by the beauty around her. She remembered the Count, who had said with a smirk on his face that she would marry the deadly Duke. She remembered how he told her that she would definitely die. In a couple of months, the lady was amazed, as she had completely forgotten about it. The man looked at her in surprise and asked if something was bothering her. Agnes looked at the man intently and asked what kind of person the Duke was. The man sighed heavily and hesitating said that the Duke was a wonderful but terrible gentleman. He said that the Duke usually does not show emotions and does not hesitate to use various dirty methods to protect his possessions. He said that the Duke would mercilessly kill anyone who dared to harm him. The young lady was stunned. She understood that he would certainly kill her too. She was very scared. A moment later, the man looking at the young lady said that they had already arrived. He looked at her and welcomed her to the Dedrick's estate. The butler looked intently at the young lady and greeted her. The butler bowed and said that the gentleman was waiting for her in the living room. The butler informed his master that the young lady had arrived. Agnes slowly entered the room and saw the Duke. The young lady in turn froze in horror as she was very worried and afraid. Moments later, she bowed, introduced herself, and said that she was very pleased to meet him. The Duke slowly approached her and told her to raise her head. He looked at her intently and said that although he had forced her to marry him, he had no intention of marrying her again. The Duke said that it would be for her own good if she went home. The young lady froze in shock. She remembered how Lady Carla constantly humiliated her and shouted that she was useless. She remembered how the Count looked at her with contempt and said that he was disappointed in her. Agnes remembered how the maids neglected her and often punished her by locking her in a dark and cold place. She was in shock because the Duke told her to go back to that hell and rotten place. She was shocked as she realized that she was useless, even for the deadly Duke. Agnes said, looking at the Duke, that she did not want to go back. She looked at him intently and said that she had already left her family and had no place to return to. Falling to her knees, she said that since he didn't need her, he could just kill her here and now. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really come here to die. Agnes sighed heavily and said that everything was correct and she was ready to accept her fate. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that he did not like killing people at all. She was surprised by such a statement. Looking at the young lady, the Duke said that if she had nowhere to go, he would think of a way to help her with it. The Duke said that she could stay in the mansion until then. He looked at her intently and asked if she agreed. The young lady was surprised and said that of course she agreed. The Duke looked at the butler and told him to take care of their guest. The young lady in turn was very glad that she remained alive. The Duke looked at the butler and, sighing heavily, said that he had already told him several times that he was not going to marry. The butler, puzzled, told the gentleman that he needed to do this as soon as possible. The Duke said that he would live as he wished, and besides he was more interested in protecting his territory and interests. The Duke remembered the young lady at their first meeting. He noticed that her hands were rough. He asked the butler if she was really the daughter of the Wilfrid family. The butler told the gentleman that if he suspected anything, he would certainly contact the bride's family. But the Duke said that there was no need for that yet. The Duke remembered how she told him that since he didn't need her, he could just kill her. The Duke thought about everything for a moment. Looking at the butler, he told him to listen to his order. He looked at the butler intently and told him to find out more information about the young lady. The Duke was furious because he realized that the Count had decided to deceive him. He could not allow this to happen. The young lady, in turn, was in the estate and slowly pondering the situation. She remembered Lady Carla, who said that she was an empty doll. She constantly mocked her. Agnes, in turn, understood that such a role was clearly not for her. The butler knocked on the gentleman's door in a hurry. He was very puzzled. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and asked what had happened. The butler hastily told the gentleman that the young lady was missing. The Duke was shocked and did not understand what he was talking about. He did not understand where the young lady could have disappeared, too. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that he had already ordered the maids to find her. He remembered the young lady saying that since he no longer needed her, He could kill her. He knew she was ready to die. The young lady, in turn, was slowly cleaning the estate. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing. Agnes froze in place, as she did not expect the Duke to come to her. She looked at him closely and said that the windows from her room looked out here, and she saw how the wind had blown a lot of leaves and decided to tidy up a bit. She looked at the Duke intently and said that he had not given such instructions, so it was her initiative. He looked at her in surprise and said that this was the work of servants. He asked if she had really come here as a servant. He looked at her intently and told her to give him an answer to his question immediately. The young lady bowed and asked for forgiveness, saying that she should have asked his permission first. He looked at her closely and said that nevertheless she had cleaned a lot and she had done it all by herself. He wanted to thank her. She froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady was amazed, as no one had ever thanked her before. A moment later, a cold wind blew, and the young lady in turn realized that she might get sick again. But a moment later, the Duke wrapped her in his cloak, and Agnes froze in place. He looked at her intently and said that dinner would be ready soon. He asked why they didn't go back to the mansion. The young lady, in turn, froze in place. She was surprised, and she felt very warm in his cape. Some time later, they were both eating in the large living room. The young lady felt uncomfortable because she did not know how to use such devices. She knew that until now she had only used one device. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that the rules of etiquette must be respected. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know what to answer or what to do. But a moment later, he looked at her sharply and said that they were alone here, so she didn't need to bother her head with such things. The Duke said with a smile that she could eat, as she wished the young lady was surprised. She was pleased to hear such things. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked in surprise if she didn't like it. Agnes smiled and said that she had never eaten anything more delicious. The Duke smiled and said that he was pleased to hear it, and also said that he would certainly pass on her words to the cook. After they had finished their meal for some time, the young lady looked intently at the Duke and called him. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted to ask. Agnes looked at him timidly and asked if they were really going to kill her after all. He looked at her in surprise and said that she still wasn't learning anything. He asked if she really wanted to die so much. Agnes looked him straight in the eye and said that she had been sent here for this very reason. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that if she married him, she would certainly die. Agnes looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke, in turn, said that he was not going to marry, but she still had nowhere to go. He asked if this was true. The young lady looked at him intently and timidly replied that it was true. He said that she had come here as a request from him, and nothing more. The Duke said that he would therefore find himself a new bride. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke, not knowing how to convey the information to her correctly, sighed heavily and said that he always sent brides home. He said that if the bride came home again and said that she had been rejected, everyone would immediately start humiliating her. He sighed heavily and said that for this reason, he came up with the legend that he kills all his wives. The Duke said he wanted her to find someone she truly wanted to marry for love. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that she should know that there is such a thing as a marriage of convenience. If they find out that the bride is alive, they will give her to another. He said that this is why brides usually chose travelers or merchants as husbands, married them, and left for distant lands. He said that they could live freely there. He smiled and said that in any case it was much better than them going back home. The young lady said timidly that everyone considered him a very frightening person. She remembered her uncle telling her that she should be proud of herself and follow her parents. She looked at him intently and said that when she met him in person, she realized that everything about him was just rumors. She smiled and said that, frankly speaking, she was very grateful to him, since for the first time in her life, someone had looked after her. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that he was a very kind man. A moment later, the Duke rose with lightning speed and slapped the table. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness. She said that she did not mean to offend him at all. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she was only his guest, and neither he nor his servants would harm her. He looked at her sideways and said that she had better rest. A moment later, the Duke of Paths knew the young lady. The Duke, in turn, thought about the situation and the young lady. He understood that, judging by her behavior, she was treated very coldly in her family, and they did not even take care of her upbringing. He was puzzled that the young lady did not even know how to use the utensils. The Duke walked slowly to his room, but suddenly heard a noise. He heard the sound of crying coming from the young lady's room. He knocked, but there was no answer. A moment later, he asked for forgiveness and entered the room. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if everything was okay with her. He saw that she was crying and asking for help. The Duke was angry. The young lady, in turn, slept quietly, and she again had the same dream in which she saw her dead parents. A moment later, she moved and was already in a tattered dress. She saw the gentleman. She saw how everyone was making fun of her and saying that she was emotionless and terrifying to everyone. They said that she was like a doll. Agnes asked for help. A moment later, she woke up to see the Duke, who was anxiously asking if she was okay. The young lady looked at him in surprise, with tears in her eyes. The Duke asked her forgiveness for entering the room without her permission. He said that he was passing by and heard her crying since she did not answer him. He decided to go in. The young lady looked at him in surprise, and a moment later noticed that she had been crying. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she had had a nightmare. With tears in her eyes, she said that she had dreamed of memories from her childhood. She said that, unfortunately, she could only watch, so she cried. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she had been through a lot. The young lady looked timidly at the Duke and said that she did not know because she had lost her memories. The Duke slowly lit a candle and poured water into a glass. He wanted to calm Agnes down a little and talk to her. The Duke presented the glass to the young lady. Agnes thanked him timidly. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she could tell him more about her loss of memories. She said it happened 8 years ago, and the gentleman picked her up. She said that she didn't remember anything until that moment. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if it really meant that she was adopted. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was true, but she still had the blood of the Wilfrid family running through her, and she only found out about it yesterday. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment. Agnes knew she should have told him about this earlier. She knew that she couldn't deceive him anyway and had to tell him everything. She said that she had been working as a maid all this time. The young lady knew that he was probably angry with her because no one would like a servant to become a bride. He looked at her intently and said that she had not had a very good life. The young lady looked at him in surprise. He came closer to her and asked if it had been hard for her to work since childhood. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that she did not know, as she was unable to express feelings and emotions due to memory loss. Agnes said that she was an empty doll. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Agnes looked at him intently and said that she was a creepy doll with no emotions, and that everyone had told her so before. Agnes looked at the Duke intently and said that she knew it was true. The Duke looked at her in shock. She sighed heavily and said that she was finally able to be of use to the Wilfrid family. The Duke asked, taken aback if that was the reason she said she could calmly accept death. Without any emotion, the young lady looked at the Duke and said that she must act like a doll until the very end, and that was her master's order. The Duke was furious. He looked at the young lady and shouted at her to stop saying such things. He came closer to her and called her. The young lady looked at him in surprise. The Duke said she was not a doll at all, said she was standing outside, shivering with cold, having nightmares and crying. He said that she, like any other ordinary person, can also feel compassion and emotions. The Duke said that she had simply been alone all this time. Agnes froze in place. She was surprised. She looked timidly at the Duke and asked if this meant that she was alive. The Duke sighed heavily and said that of course it was. He looked at her intently and said that he would not let her die and that she must live on. He asked if there was anything she would like to do. He wanted to help her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would like to know more about herself. The Duke smiled and said that he would certainly help her with this. Agnes was glad. The young lady, in turn, was surprised that he decided to help her, but still thanked him with a smile. The maid looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the outfit suited her very well. Agnes was surprised, as she did not expect such a result. She thanked the maid with a smile on her face for her help. The maid smiled, looking at the mistress, and said that she had addressed her informally and also asked for help if she needed anything. The Duke, in turn, sat and waited for the young lady, and in the meantime slowly examined and studied the documents. A moment later, the young lady entered the dining room and greeted the Duke and also apologized for the previous evening. The Duke looked at her and said that it was he who burst into her room. He asked why she was apologizing. She looked at him in surprise and apologized again. A moment later, she also thanked him for talking to her yesterday. The Duke looked at the young lady with a gaze and said with a smile that she was very beautiful. The young lady was surprised. The Duke said that she had no knowledge of the life and conduct of nobles, even if she were considered a bride. He looked at her and said that it was clearly not going to be easy for her. The young lady was scared. She didn't know what to do. The Duke said that she had absolutely no memories of her childhood, and that there could be problems with that too, like yesterday. The young lady froze in place. She was very worried and did not know what to do in this situation. The Duke said he wasn't yelling at her and she could relax. He said she looked like he was scolding her. He looked at her intently and said that he had only stated dry facts about her. The Duke looked at her intently and asked if she would like to live in the estate. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She was surprised. The Duke said that she would learn everything until she found a good husband. Naturally, he would help her regain all her lost memories. He looked at her, asked what she would tell us, gave her an offer. Agnes timidly said that if he did not mind, then she would like to stay here. The Duke looked at her closely and said with a smile that it seemed they had made up their minds. The butler said that Ubel Wilfrid lost his brother and his wife 8 years ago, and he found and adopted the little lady. The Duke asked if there were any documents describing her parents and the reasons for their death. The butler looked at the Duke intently and said that there was no information in the official documents. The Duke asked if someone was deliberately hiding information, and the butler sighed heavily and said that it seemed that way. The butler asked the gentleman if he really liked the young lady. The Duke said that he did not intend to marry. The Duke said that he had sworn that he would marry only the one, even if it took him his whole life to find her. The butler looked at his master in surprise. The Duke asked what he and the teacher had to offer the young lady. The Duke looked closely at the butler and asked if he had found anyone. The butler, looking at the gentleman, asked what about the daughter of Viscount Fuchs. The butler told the gentleman that they owed him something. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed with the butler. He told him to send them a letter. At the same time, at the Viscount's estate, the young lady was rejoicing that her time had finally come. She knew that, after all the Duke's brides before this were just fakes because she was the real one, his bride. The Duke looked at the young lady and introduced her new teacher. He said that the lady's name was Mia Fuchs, and she was the daughter of a Viscount. Mia looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very pleased to meet her. Mia came closer to Agnes and said that she already knew that she had been through a lot. Mia said with a smile that she would do her best to make her a proper lady. She said that she was looking forward to working together. Mia looked at the young lady and asked if anyone had ever told her that she was a real beauty. Mia said that although they were teacher and student, they were the same age and could get along. The Duke looked at Agnes and told her not to overdo it with her studies. The Duke looked at Mia and said with a smile that he was counting on her. Mia looked at the Duke with a smile and said that everything would be done in the best possible way. As he left, the Duke smiled and told Agnes that they would see each other later. Agnes looked at the Duke intently and agreed with him with a smile. Mia looked sideways at the young lady with a smirk on her face and said that it was time for them to start their classes. Mia looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that first of all, they needed to understand her level of knowledge, so they needed to take a small test. The young lady sighed heavily, but still agreed she knew that she knew nothing about studying at all, and it would be difficult for her. Mia smiled looking at the lady and said that she would read a poem from this book and she should try to write it down on a piece of paper. Mia said that this method is widely used to teach writing. She smiled and said that it brought back memories of her own childhood. The young lady sighed heavily, as she herself had no memories of her childhood. Agnes looked at the teacher intently and asked for forgiveness. She would like to talk to her and explain her difficult situation. Mia looked at the young lady intently and said with a fake smile that it was not allowed to talk in class without the teacher's permission, and besides, they were already starting classes. Agnes looked hard at the young lady but said nothing. Mia, in turn, knew that Agnes would not be able to write a word because she did not have a proper education. She knew that Agnes had lost her memory and worked as a servant. Mia knew there was no point in training her like this. Mia knew that the Duke wanted to find himself a good wife, and she would certainly help him. She wanted to get rid of a simple servant. She looked at the young lady with a smirk, as she did not see her as a rival. She did not understand what could be found in someone like her. Mia, in turn, felt sorry for the Duke. She wanted to quickly show the talentless side of the young lady and throw her out of the mansion. Agnes, in turn, was puzzled and did not know what to do. Since she had never read a single book, she wondered how she should hold the pen correctly. For a moment she froze, as she felt a familiar sensation. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening. Mia smiled looking at the young lady and said that they were already starting classes. Slowly she began to read a poem from the book. The young lady heard a familiar poem and froze in place. Suddenly, memories came flooding back to her. Madame looked at her daughter and said with a smile that today they could read the book. She said that it was a wonderful story about a prince and princess who fell in love with each other. Agnes wanted to meet the same prince. She was surprised because these words were in her dream. The madam smiled, looking at her daughter, and said that she hoped that her daughter would one day be able to find her wonderful prince. Mia, in turn, slowly read the poem. She sighed heavily as she realized that the young lady seemed to know how to write. She looked at Agnes and said they could take a break. Mia came closer to the young lady and said that she wanted to see what she had done, wondering if she had written anything correctly at all. Mia was shocked because she noticed that the young lady could write. She was furious because the girl lied to her, and even her handwriting was very beautiful. Mia was furious because Agnes didn't make a single mistake, even in a text that adults could make mistakes in. The young lady looked at the teacher with a surprised look and asked for forgiveness. Mia smiled a fake smile as she looked at the young lady and said that everything was fine. She said that she was the daughter of the Wilfred family, and it would be stupid to think that she couldn't write. The young lady, in turn, was surprised that she could write, but she just knew yes, but there is also speaking, and that it appeared unexpectedly, as if it had always been there. Agnes was very happy because she realized that she was slowly beginning to remember her childhood. A moment later, Mia placed a stack of books on the table and said with a sly smile that they could increase the difficulty. Mia said that in order to become a fine lady, she needs to study hard, especially etiquette and art, as these are all mandatory components of any noble. Mia said that she will not give her any slack, even though she lost her memory. Mia looked at Agnes with a smile and told her to do all this quickly and find herself a wonderful new husband. Mia said that she did not want the Duke to constantly worry about her. The young lady looked at the teacher in surprise and timidly said that she would try. While Mia was resting, Agnes slowly and diligently studied all the information. A moment later, the Duke knocked at the door, and the young lady in turn was very glad that the Duke had come to them. Entering the room, he looked at them intently and asked how things were going with them. Mia smiled looking at the Duke and said that Lady Agnes had excellent basic knowledge, and if she was given a little time, she would be able to learn everything. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked if it was not surprising. He smiled and said that her problem was gradually being solved. Agnes looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she was also surprised. The Duke said that most likely when she lost her memory, she already had some basic knowledge. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he may not remember, but deep in her head, there are still memories. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she thought the same as him. The Duke said that it was only the first day, and they still had plenty of time, so she didn't need to rush and learn everything at once. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and thanked him. She said that he did not need to worry about her. She smiled and said that she still wanted to learn everything as soon as possible. Mia, in turn, stood and watched their dialogue intently. She was furious, as they were having a nice conversation. She did not understand why the Duke was so kind to her. She was furious, and this made her very angry. Mia knew the young lady was just impudent, and she didn't understand why Agnes was trying to apologize for everything. Mia wondered if the young lady didn't understand her situation. Mia was furious. She knew that if the girl didn't understand her situation, she would make her understand. She knew that she would soon be rid of it, and she would be near the Duke. But suddenly the Duke called her, and she quickly put her thoughts in order. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and called her. Mia was very glad that the Duke was calling her and ran up to him at full speed. The Duke looked closely at the young lady. Mia, in turn, was embarrassed by such closeness. The Duke, looking at the young lady, said that she was too prejudiced against Agnes. He said that he understood that she was trying to do the best to educate her quickly, but still he wanted her to be more gentle with Agnes. The Duke came closer to her and asked if she understood him. He said that if he saw two difficult tasks again, she would have only herself to blame. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect to hear such a thing. As he left, the Duke turned and looked at the young lady with a smile. He said that they would see each other at dinner. Agnes, in turn, saw the Duke off with a smile. She was very glad that he took care of her. Mia was very angry. She did not understand why the Duke treated her like that. Agnes looked at the teacher in surprise and called her. She did not understand her change of mood. A moment later, Mia came closer to her and pushed her away with fury. Mia looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she had overdone it a bit. Agnes looked at the teacher in surprise. She didn't understand what had happened and why she was treating her like that. Mia smiled a fake smile and looked at the young lady and said that she wanted to ask her something. Mia asked if she was really going to take the Duke away from her. Mia said that, after all, he already had a bride and he had been looking for a long time. Agnes looked at the teacher in surprise. Mia smiled and said that he had promised his bride when he was little that he would marry her. Mia looked at Agnes and asked who she thought that person was. Mia looked at the young lady intently and asked if she didn't know. A moment later, Mia looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that it was her. Mia said that Gil didn't remember her. She looked at the young lady with fury and said that if she thought she could take him away from her, then she was sorely mistaken. Mia glared at the young lady and told her to stop acting like she didn't understand anything. Mia walked closer to the young lady who was sitting on the floor and looking at her in surprise. Mia told her to get away from her Duke. The maid was slowly preparing the young lady for the exit. She was in a good mood, as she enjoyed communicating with Agnes. A moment later, the maid was taken aback. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked where she got the bruises. Agnes hesitated and looked at the maid in surprise. She covered the bruises so that no one would see them. Agnes timidly said that she had just fallen. And in any case, it didn't hurt anymore, which meant everything was fine. But in fact, the injury was inflicted on her by the teacher, who constantly punished the young lady. The maid looked at the young lady intently and asked excitedly what this Lady Mia had done to her. After this question, the young lady shuddered but did not answer. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that Lady Mia said that in order to concentrate on their lessons, they were forbidden to even go near that room. The maid looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that she was very worried about her because she saw her sad look when she was next to the teacher. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that if anything like that happened to her, she was obliged to report everything to the master. Agnes sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that, since she had simply fallen, and that was all. She looked at the maid and asked her not to say anything to the Duke about her injuries. Agnes said that she did not want to get into trouble because of her later. The maid wanted to object, but the young lady did not allow her to do so. Agnes said that besides, Lady Mia was very important to the Duke. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She did not understand what was being discussed. The maid looked at her watch and told the young lady that classes were about to start. As Agnes left the room, she looked closely at the maid and thanked her with a smile for all the kindness she had shown her. The maid was shocked and confused. She did not expect to hear something like that. Agnes, in turn, knew that compared to her previous family's home, this was much better. She remembered the Duke telling her that she was not a doll at all. She knew that she was no longer an empty doll. She was glad that the Duke had supported her then and said such pleasant words to her. Agnes knew that now everything was different. The young lady entered the classroom and greeted her teacher with a smile. She looked at her intently and said that she was looking forward to their lesson. Mia looked at the young lady in surprise, but still greeted her with a fake smile. She came closer to her and said that when Agnes was so serious about her studies, she even began to glow with happiness. Mia grabbed the young lady's arm where she had been injured. Agnes frowned as she was in a lot of pain. Mia looked at the young lady with fury and said that she couldn't believe that Agnes had kept quiet about the beatings. Mia asked if Agnes was trying to be a pretty girl. For everyone, Mia said with fury that she should understand that there was no point in this. Mia pressed even harder on the arm where the injuries were, and with a smirk on her face, asked the young lady if it hurt, asked Agnes if she had changed her mind and wanted to leave the mansion. Agnes, gathering her courage, said that she would never do such a thing. Agnes looked at her teacher and asked why she was so eager to throw her out of the estate. The young lady looked at Agnes with a smirk and said that she had serious statements. She said she was just trying to show that she didn't belong there. Agnes looked at her teacher in surprise and bewilderment. Mia said that she also had to marry a stranger and die at his hands. Mia looked at Agnes intently and said that her family would never see her again. She asked with a smirk if that wasn't sad. Mia said that while it was not too late, she could go home. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if Agnes understood what she was talking about now. Agnes looked at her teacher and said that although she said so, she still had no home to return to. Mia was stunned by this statement. She did not expect to hear something like that. But a moment later, she said that nothing could be done about it. Mia looked at the young lady closely and said with a smirk that they needed to study, and today she would learn to play the piano. Mia looked at the young lady and, pointing to the notes, told her to try to play this melody. Agnes was puzzled. Since this was her first game, she understood that there would be punishment here. She understood that although she could already read the notes, she still would not be able to play as she should. From the very first minutes, the young lady made a mistake. Mia angrily said that she was playing incorrectly and hit her on the hands. The young lady froze for a moment. Mia looked at Agnes with fury and contempt and asked why she stopped. Mia told the young lady to continue playing. The young lady, in turn, did not answer and continued her game. She made mistakes several times, and each time the teacher punished her, she hit her on the hands. Mia looked at the young lady with a smirk and told her to start all over again. After that, the young lady made a few more mistakes and again got her punishment. Mia looked at her with a smirk and said that she was very bad at the game, and she was already starting to worry about her. Mia said that they now need to move on to another subject. The young lady in turn looked closely at the sheet of paper with the task she knew that she had studied for a long time and would certainly be able to solve this problem. She reached for the pen, but it fell out of her hands. She was in shock as her fingers were very sore after the lesson, and she could not even hold the first one in her hand. Mia looked closely at the young lady and said with a smirk that the time was up and they needed to look at the result. Agnes shuddered as she understood that she was going to be punished again. Mia looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she had not solved a single problem. She looked at her with fury and said that she was just a blockhead. Mia looked at the young lady with a smirk and disdain and said that in that case there was no way she could become a true lady. Mia looked away from her in surprise and said that she did not understand at all why the Duke was so worried about her. Mia looked at Agnes with fury and asked if she had seduced the Duke. She said that she knew that servants had no pride. Agnes froze in shock. She did not know what to answer. Mia sighed heavily and said that she knew that the Duke was not so preoccupied as to climb under the skirt of the first person he came across. She said that it was simply out of the question. Mia looked at the young lady with disdain and said that she was also quite boring. Agnes was shocked by everything her teacher said. Agnes looked at her teacher intently and got to know her. Looking at her teacher, she asked if she could ask her something. Agnes, without taking her gaze off her, asked if she was really the Duke's fiancée. Mia looked at the young lady with anger and asked what she was talking about. She was shocked and did not expect to hear such a question. Agnes looked at the young lady closely and said that from the Duke's point of view, she was just another unwanted bride. She said that he listened to her carefully and was always ready to help her. Agnes looked closely at her teacher and said that she must have noticed by now how the Duke treated her. Agnes looked at the teacher in surprise and asked why he was treating her so casually if she said she was his fiancée. Mia, in turn, was burning with anger. She didn't know what to answer and looked intently at the young lady. Mia began to mumble something incoherently. A moment later she said, with a puzzled smile, that it was all because of the promise he made to her as a child. She said that most likely the Duke had simply forgotten her face. Agnes looked at her teacher in surprise and asked if she still believed in the childhood promise. She looked at the teacher intently and asked if the Duke remembered about it. The young lady froze in shock. A moment later she turned around and slapped Agnes across the face with fury. Mia grabbed some ink that was at hand and threw it at Agnes in anger. Mia was very angry. She screamed at the young lady to shut her mouth. The young lady, in turn, was slowly falling as the teacher hit her very hard. Mia looked at the young lady with fury and contempt and asked what she knew about her. She screamed that the Duke would definitely be hers. Mia screamed that the Duke would definitely be hers, even if he didn't remember that she was his true bride. She looked at the young lady with fury and asked her if she knew how long she had been waiting to meet him. She was furious because he still did not notice her. She screamed that instead of being with him, she was now training some incompetent girl on his orders. She screamed furiously that the young lady was just stupid. Agnes looked at her and told her to stop. Mia looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Agnes looked closely at her teacher and asked her not to insult the Duke anymore. You too. At that time, she changed her face and changed her appearance. Her eyes changed color, and her hair became lighter. Mia noticed that the young lady had started to puff early. She was shocked by the young lady's changed appearance and screamed in a trembling voice that she was just a monster. Suddenly, the young lady was illuminated by light, and her wound on her forehead slowly began to heal without looking up at the teacher. She said that she didn't care what she thought of her. Mia was in shock. She was shaking with fear because she did not understand why the young lady's wound began to heal. Agnes stood up and looked intently at her teacher. She asked her not to insult the Duke anymore. Mia and she were very scared and screamed for Agnes not to come near her because she was a monster. Mia ran out in a hurry and screamed for someone to help her. Agnes looked intently after the running teacher and said that she did not care who she complained to, since she was sure that the Duke would listen to her anyway. Agnes said that when the Duke found out how she had treated her, she would be in trouble. Agnes looked at the teacher intently and said that she no longer intended to hide the truth. Mia ran out of the room and said angrily that classes were over for today. She was very scared. Agnes, in turn, thought for a moment about what Mia had said. She thought that maybe it was true, and the Duke simply didn't remember anything. The young lady, in turn, thought that she had threatened her teacher in vain. She looked in the mirror in surprise because her appearance had changed. She was surprised she did not understand what was happening. The young lady sat looking out the window and pondered the situation. She was surprised as her eyes and hair had changed. Like last time she was puzzled. She didn't know what was happening to her. A moment later, the Duke entered her room and said with a smile that her teacher had gone home early that day. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect him to come to her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and with a gentle smile said that if she did not get along with her teacher, she could tell her, and he would immediately find her another teacher. Agnes, in turn, did not want to cause him any trouble, and thanking him for his concern, said that there was no need for it. She smiled and said that everything was fine. Agnes looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile on her face that she was no longer a doll and that she had a good relationship with the teacher. She, in turn, wanted to figure everything out on her own. She was very glad that for the first time she was able to respond with dignity and fight back against her offender. The Duke looked closely at the young lady but did not answer. A moment later, he looked at her closely and said that she could do as she knew he was surprised, and said with a smile that she had changed a lot in such a short time. The young lady was very happy to hear such a thing from the Duke. She looked at him with a soft smile. The Duke looked out of the window and saw that the weather was fine. He asked the young lady why they didn't go horse riding tomorrow. He wanted to lighten the mood a little. Looking at Agnes, the Duke told her not to worry, so much as he would certainly show her how to ride a horse properly. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She thought for a moment, as she had bad memories of horses. The young lady was slowly cleaning the garden, but suddenly someone called her. The young lady looked at the maid with a smirk and told her to come to her for a second. Agnes looked at Lady Carla in surprise. She was very scared. Lady Carla said, with a grin, that she had accidentally dropped the book when she got out of the carriage, pointing to the book to the lady and telling the maid to come and pick it up. The lady told the maid with a grin that if she did not hurry, the horses would certainly trample the book, which in turn was very valuable. Agnes slowly went to carry out the order. Everyone present watched Agnes closely, with grins on their faces. Agnes slowly bent down to pick up the book. She was very afraid, but she still knew that she had no choice, and she had to do it. She didn't have time to reach the book when suddenly the horse reared up in anger. Agnes looked at the horse. In fear, she saw only one of its hooves. The horse struck her. The young lady stood with her teacher near the stables. Agnes, in turn, was very worried, as she was very scared of horses, but she knew that today the Duke would be next to her. Mia looked at the young lady with fury. She knew that Agnes was a real monster. She didn't understand how Agnes could be so calm after last night. The Duke came closer to them and with a smile asked Agnes's forgiveness for keeping her waiting. A moment later, he looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what was wrong. Agnes looked at him in surprise and said that everything was fine. Mia, in turn, hurriedly approached the Duke. The young lady looked timidly at the Duke and said that it seemed that Lady Agnes was a little afraid of horses. The Duke looked at all the ladies present in surprise and asked if this was true. Mia knew that now was her chance to speak to the Duke in such a manner. She was very pleased with herself, as she had mixed the stimulant into the horse's feed. She knew that the show was about to start, as they would immediately go wild. She knew that as soon as she mounted the horse, she would certainly lure the Duke after her, and this woman who did not know how to ride would fall under the hooves of the terrible horse. She knew that she had to immediately save her lover from the monster. She knew that when the Duke learned the whole truth about the young lady, he would immediately get rid of her. Agnes said timidly that long ago she had been forced to pick something up from under a horse's hooves and had hit it. The Duke was shocked. He sighed heavily and said that it was very good that she survived and that she was lucky in this situation. He looked at her closely and said that horses should not be approached from behind. The Duke said that the horse simply sensed danger and was reflexively trying to protect itself. He looked at the young lady and said with a smile that the horse acted instinctively and did not intentionally hurt her. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she knew the horse was innocent, but she was still a little afraid of them. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked with a puzzled smile if they would go for a ride today. He came closer to her and said with a smile that he was not even telling her that he smiled, and said that he would certainly do everything in his power to make her stop being afraid of horses. The young lady was very surprised, but also glad that he cared about her. The Duke looked at the horse and said with a smile that he would like to introduce his friend to her. He smiled and said that his name was Sieg. The Duke looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she could touch him, as he was not dangerous. The young lady agreed. She was very worried and trembled with fear. The Duke came closer to her and hugged her tenderly. He told her to calm down and not worry because he was next to her. The Duke smiled and said that if she was worried, the horse would sense it and start too. He said that she should be braver since no one was going to attack her. The young lady sighed heavily and collected her thoughts. A moment later, she walked up to the horse and stroked him with a smile. She said she was looking forward to working with him today. The Duke smiled as he looked at his companion and said that he seemed to like the young lady very much. She came closer to him and stroked him with a smile. She said that the horse was very cute. Mia came closer to them and said with a smile that the Duke had a very beautiful horse. She smiled and stepped between the two of them. She said that she would also like to say hello to the horse, but unexpectedly for everyone, the horse reared up. The Duke was surprised, as he did not expect this. The Duke looked at his friend in surprise and called him. But a moment later, they turned away towards the noise and saw that the horses had rebelled. Mia, in turn, looked at the horses with a grin, as she was glad that the show had begun. The Duke hastily shouted to the young ladies to run to the mansion immediately. Mia knew that anyone who didn't manage to escape would immediately become an easy target for the maddened horse. She looked at the young lady with a smirk, because she knew that she would die here and now. Mia accidentally pushed Agnes. Agnes, in turn, shouted at the Duke as she was excited. The young lady was very frightened as she saw the Duke's enraged horse flying towards her. Mia was in shock. She was very scared because a horse was running towards her lover. But a moment later, the young lady pushed the Duke away. The Duke was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing. Agnes decided to take the blow steadfastly. She looked intently at the horse that was racing towards her. The Duke stood frozen in shock as he looked at the young lady who was falling before him. He shouted at her in rage, but unfortunately he did not hear a response. A moment later, he picked her up in his arms. Mia screamed in horror. She was in shock because she did not expect that everything would turn out this way. The men came to the young lady in a hurry and asked her to calm down, otherwise the horses might go crazy again. The man shouted that she needed to be taken to the mansion. The young lady, in turn, shouted that she was very scared, and she was very afraid. She called for the Duke. She looked at the Duke intently and screamed furiously, but he did not answer, as he was busy bandaging the young lady's wound. With tears in her eyes, she screamed that she had also suffered. She screamed and called for the Duke, but all was in vain. She saw him leaving with the young lady in his arms. She screamed that she was also very scared and that she was afraid. She looked after the Duke in bewilderment, because she did not understand why he did not choose her. She was furious, because she knew that this was not a woman, but real monsters. The Duke looked at the young lady with puzzlement and intentness. He saw that she had a serious wound. He was agitated and did not understand why she did this. Some time later, the maids looked after the young lady with tenderness and care. The Duke looked at the man closely and asked if there was anyone else who had been hurt in the skirmish with the horses. The man looked at the gentleman closely and said that only the young lady had been hurt, as the horses had calmed down and there was no cause for concern. The man looked at the gentleman closely and said that evidence had been found that some sort of stimulant had been added to the food. The Duke frowned for a moment and sighed heavily, saying that there was a possibility that an attempt had been made on his life. He looked at the man and said that the investigation needed to be continued. The man said that he would certainly do everything. Meanwhile, the Duke was thinking about the whole situation. He did not understand why the young lady protected him, but suffered herself. He knew that when they first met, she was already prepared to accept death at his hands. At that moment, this situation amused him greatly. Mia walked up to the Duke quietly and asked with fury if that girl was really that important to him. The Duke shuddered, as he didn't expect the young lady to come to him. Mia looked at the Duke intently and asked if that girl was more important than his bride. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Mia asked the Duke about the promise they made to each other in childhood. The Duke looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The young lady came closer to him and said with a smile that if he could not remember her, she would certainly help him. A moment later, she touched his face tenderly and said with a smile that she was the bride he had been looking for. For a long time, she looked at him intently and said that it was she back when they were little. Mia said with a smile that when they were children, they would exchange glances without saying a word. She smiled a soft smile and said that they had made a promise to each other about their engagement. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. He looked at her intently, pushing her hand away. He said that he had actually met her when he was a child. He said they were just sitting together at a table where adults were talking. He looked at the young lady with surprise and puzzlement and asked her if she really thought it was an engagement. The young lady looked at him closely and said that he seemed to remember poorly, as it had been a long time ago. She said that at that time, she was the only pretty girl around him, and he wanted to get engaged to her. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that she was talking complete nonsense. The young lady froze in place, with a smile on her face. She was shocked by such a statement, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said calmly that his bride had distinctive features that could not be forgotten. He looked at the young lady intently and said with fury that it was definitely not her. Mia was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such an answer from him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that his bride was special to him. He said that frankly speaking, he did not like it when he was confused with someone else, but if she would correct this misunderstanding immediately, he would forgive her. The young lady rushed towards him in a rage and shouted that she loved him. The Duke was furious at such insolence of the young lady. Mia looked at the Duke and said that even today she protected him from Agnes. She screamed that the young lady must be gotten rid of immediately, as she was a real monster. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, he pushed her away and asked angrily if she had put something in the horse's food. Mia was in shock as she realized that she had been exposed and punishment would be inevitable. She timidly began to mumble something and said in a puzzled tone that she did everything for him. The Duke looked at her with fury. He was very angry because she had put them all in great danger. He approached her and said that he had chosen her as a teacher because he thought Agnes would be comfortable with someone her own age. He said he thought it would be a good incentive for the young lady to study harder. Mia, in turn, was trembling with fear. She was very scared, since a terrible and threatening aura emanated from the Duke. The Duke looked at the young lady with fury and said that he was wrong. and his decision had only put the young lady in danger. He looked at her with fury and said that he should have thrown her out of the estate much earlier. Mia froze in shock. She did not believe that the Duke said something like that to her. She knew that she was the daughter of an aristocrat, and she had very good manners, unlike that servant who could easily be replaced. She knew that she was much more important than some worthless monster. She knew that this was very strange and completely unhealthy. She thought that most likely the Duke was disgraced by the fact that his horse had gone mad, and for this reason, he immediately thought of her. She knew that everything was already special for him. She turned around puzzled and asked the Duke what was going on. The young lady was surprised and puzzled as she saw the Duke standing surrounded by his servants. The Duke looked at her with rage and said that she was a criminal who had attempted his life. He ordered the servants to seize her immediately. The young lady was stunned. She froze in bewilderment at this statement, looking at the Duke, as she could not believe everything that was happening. She screamed that they should not touch her. Mia, in turn, screamed at the Duke with tears in her eyes and asked him to listen to her. She screamed that she would never go that far again. She looked at him intently, with tears in her eyes, and said that she swears this to him. She lay on the floor and, bursting into tears, screamed at the Duke and begged him to stay with her. She knew that if he stayed with her, he would not be able to resist her charm. She looked at him intently, as she knew he would support her. The Duke of Ye, in turn, looked at her with disdain and asked if she really thought he would fall in love with her if she just stood there. The young lady hesitated, as she was surprised that he said that she wondered if he could read minds. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he had great respect for Agnes, who had risked herself to protect him. He looked at her with fury and said that she simply ran away from responsibility. The young lady looked intently at the Duke. She was trembling with fear. The Duke said furiously. What he thought his answer was now clear. As he left, he cast a furious and cold look at her. He said that if she caught his eye again, he would certainly take her life like a true Duke of Death. The Duke said that the young lady in turn called Agnes a monster, but she was the one who looked the most like a monster here. He looked with contempt at the young lady who lay on the ground and said that she was a disgusting monster. The doctor looked at the Duke and said with a smile that, fortunately, the young lady's life was no longer in danger, and she was already recovering, so she should wake up soon. The Duke sat quietly in the young lady's room and watched her intently. The Duke looked closely at Agnes and noticed that the bandage on her forehead had loosened a little. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and asked if she minded if he rebandaged the bandage. He said he wanted her to wake up as soon as possible. After removing the bandage, he froze in surprise. He was surprised because he noticed that the wound had healed. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the young lady. He did not understand how fat she could disappear so easily, but suddenly memories came flooding back to him, and he saw a young girl who said that everything was fine and that she would definitely help him. He remembered her beautiful blonde hair. He was surprised because she looked very beautiful. The young man froze, looking at the young lady who was next to him. She in turn said that she would certainly help him. The Duke sighed heavily and told himself that this simply could not be. Some time later, Agnes finally woke up and looked around the room in surprise. She didn't understand where she was. A moment later, she remembered that a horse had hit her. The young lady, in turn, thought that she had been brought into the room so that she would not interfere. The Duke looked at the young lady with a heavy sigh and said with a smile that he was very glad that she had finally woken up. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. The Duke of Ra looked at her with fury and said that he absolutely had to tell her something. She was surprised and looked at him intently. As she was very worried, Agnes saw that he was very angry. She did not understand what exactly had upset him. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that jumping in front of an angry horse was suicide. He was furious and did not understand why she did such a thing at all. The young lady sighed heavily and said that her body jerked and she thought that he might get hurt. He sighed heavily and said that he was able to protect himself. The young lady timidly said that if he had been hurt, everyone in the mansion as well as Mia would have been very sad. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what Mia had to do with it. He was puzzled and did not understand why she suddenly started talking about her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and timidly began to say something. She asked if she could say it. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was even talking about. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was very important to him. The Duke sighed heavily, looking at the young lady, and said that she was not his fiancée. Agnes was surprised by the Duke's statements. The Duke said that the young lady had made it all up. He looked at Agnes with a puzzled expression and said that he had made no such promise to her. In turn, at first she thought so, but her teacher was very convincing. She was confident in her words, so Agnes doubted her rightness. The Duke looked at the young lady with anger and said that because of her selfish beliefs, Mia committed a crime. He was very angry. The Duke said that such a thing would not happen again. Agnes looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke came closer to the young lady and called her. He looked at her tenderly and said that it was true that he was looking for his lost bride. He sighed sadly and said that it was not Mia at all. One lady in turn timidly asked him for forgiveness. The Duke, puzzled, said that she had no need to apologize to him, since it was he who should apologize. He said that unfortunately, it was he who appointed the young lady as her teacher. The Duke said he was very sorry he had put her in danger. The young lady was taken aback and, looking at the Duke, said that he did not have to apologize to her since she was completely fine. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said tenderly that he wished she would take better care of herself. The Duke said sadly that he was horrified when he saw her bleeding. He said he couldn't imagine her getting hurt. He looked at her and said tenderly that she had to imagine that someone important to her would get hurt. He said that she would be very sad. The young lady, in turn, was surprised, as she did not expect that she was important to him. She remembered how he said with a smile on his face that he would not let her die and she would live on. Then he asked her if there was anything she wanted to do. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she was very glad that he was safe. The Duke smiled and said that he was perfectly fine and also thanked her, as he was very worried about her. The young lady looked at the Duke and said with a smile that he didn't need to worry about her at all. She said that her wound would surely heal quickly. The Duke looked at her with puzzlement and surprise. The Duke was puzzled, as he knew that this was too fast for such a wound. He did not understand how this was even possible, and suddenly memories from his childhood came flooding back to him. The Duke looked at her closely and asked if she could keep it a secret that she was recovering quickly. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke gave her, but her lady, a serious look and said that she must promise him this. Suddenly, she remembered her mother, who told her that she should keep her abilities a secret. She said with an embarrassed smile that she understood everything and would keep everything a secret. The Duke smiled and said that in return, he would promise her something. He looked at the young lady intently and said that from now on he would erase all the sparks that would fall on her. She froze in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The maid smiled as she looked at the young lady and said that she was very glad that Agnes had recovered in just a few days. Agnes smiled timidly at the maid and asked her forgiveness for making her worry about her. The maid smiled and said that it didn't matter at all, and the main thing was that she was alive and well. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke was waiting for her outside. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and said that he thought it would be a terrible thing if she did come to hate horses. The young lady touched the horse tenderly and said with a smile that she was very glad to see him again. The Duke smiled as he looked at Agnes and said that it seemed he had worried in vain. A moment later, the Duke mounted his horse with lightning speed. He smiled at the young lady and said that she could climb on and they would ride together. The young lady agreed and grabbed the Duke's hand. and with lightning speed he helped her onto the horse. The Duke smiled and said that everything would be fine. Since he was next to her, he quietly whispered in her ear that they would move slowly. The young lady in turn was very embarrassed by such closeness. The Duke looked at the young lady with puzzlement and asked me if she was afraid. Agnes said that she was not afraid at all. He smiled and said that then they could speed up a little. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they had already arrived at the place, so she could open her eyes. The young lady in turn slowly opened her eyes and froze in amazement. She was shocked because she saw a beautiful landscape. She saw a meadow with beautiful and luxurious flowers. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he wanted to show her this place. The young lady smiled. Looking at the Duke, Agnes was very grateful to him. She said with a smile that the place was really very beautiful. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he was very glad that she liked it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was actually thinking about her new tutor. He said that the next teacher would definitely be on her side. The Duke said he was needed someone who was well informed about the peculiarities of his mansion and flexible in some way. The young lady in turn understood that if she had a new teacher, she would need to study more. She knew she had to do this to be a worthy bride. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would be glad to have any mentor. The Duke smiled and said that since it did not matter to her, then he would become her mentor. The young lady froze in place, as she was surprised. She didn't expect to hear something like that. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such a reaction from her. Gilbert looked at her closely and asked if she really did not want him to be her teacher, since she frowned so much. The young lady was surprised. She said that everything was not like that at all, and she was very glad. The Duke in turn was shocked. Agnes was shocked, as she realized that she had said this without much confidence. She looked at the Duke with embarrassment. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and thanked him. The Duke smiled as he looked at his companion and said with a smile that she had no need to thank him. A moment later, as they were strolling leisurely, the young lady gazed at the beautiful scenery of the area and told the Duke that she was very happy here. Agnes looked at the Duke and said that she was very grateful to everyone for their kindness to her, although it made her wary. Agnes said she still wondered if it was possible to be so generous to her. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said that she deserved to be happy. He said with a smile on his face that they all wanted her to smile too. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was grateful to him for such pleasant words. The Duke looked away timidly and said that it would be better for her to call him by his first name, since he was not very comfortable when she addressed him by his status. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile, and also called him by name. The servant looked at his master intently and said that Agnes was supposed to die when she married the Duke of Death, but she was still alive. The Count said with a grin on his face that everything was going according to plan. The servant looked at the Count with puzzlement and asked if he was not surprised. The Count said with a grin on his face that he had waited 10 years, but unfortunately she never woke up. The Count said that the proposal of marriage came just in time, and for this reason he sent her to the Duke of Death. He wanted her to enjoy this calm while she could. The Duke looked at the delicate flower and said with a smile on his face that this blue flower was called Irene. He looked at the flowers puzzledly and said that he was not sure about those red flowers, since they still looked like purple ones. The young lady looked closely at the flowers and said with a smile that they were sepiora, both red and purple. The Duke looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that she seemed to know a lot. He asked if she had read it in an encyclopedia. She looked at the Duke in surprise and said that this was not so, but in turn wondered how she knew such information. The young lady froze in surprise as memories came flooding back to her. She saw a little girl who took her hand and told her to follow her. She froze in place as she saw that the girl had led her to her own mother. She was puzzled because she remembered this dream, which she had seen many times. The girl looked at her intently and said that this was not just a dream, but her true memories from childhood. The girl looked at her and told her to remember her. She told her to remember everything. A moment later, Agnes saw the girl rushing towards her mother, screaming and crying, calling for her parents. She screamed with tears in her eyes and asked someone to help her. She wanted her parents to save her. The madam took her daughter and hugged her tightly. She told her daughter not to cry. The girl looked at her mother and asked what happened. The madam looked intently at her daughter and said that the man was thirsty for their death and he wanted to make her his puppet. The lady looked at her daughter intently and said with a smile on her face that everything was fine and she would not allow him to do this. The madam said that they would definitely cast a spell on their daughter so that she could grow up happy. A moment later, the young lady saw that madam had fallen lifeless to the ground. The girl was crying and calling for her mother. Agnes was in shock. She couldn't help believing what she was seeing. The man approached the young girl and told her with a smirk that it was all her fault. He said that her parents were already dead and her little friend was also hurt. He came closer to her and said with a smirk that it was all her fault because if she had calmly gone with him, then nothing like this would have happened. The young lady was shocked as she realized that this was her past. Now she knew that her parents were no longer in this world. The young lady looked at the girl and said that it looked like she was her as a child. The girl sighed heavily and said that it was so and also called the young lady to follow her. The man looked at the girl with a grin and said that he finally got her. He was glad and looking at the young lady with a grin, said that now she was his. He shouted that her power was now in his power. The young lady in turn trembled with fear and cried. He screamed that she was his property. Taking her hand, he pulled and made a cut on her hand. A moment later, a bright light illuminated the young girl, and her wound healed. The man said with a grin that he was very glad, as he had been looking for her and her miraculous power for a long time. The young lady turned away, as she could no longer bear to look at this terrible spectacle. A moment later, she noticed that the girl's wound had healed. The man, in turn, burst into hysterical laughter. He said that if he took possession of her, he would become the savior of this world. The young lady, in turn, was breathing heavily as she realized that terrible things had been done to her in the past. The girl looked at the young lady and said that her mother protected her. Agnes looked closely at the girl, who was in the cage, and noticed that her hair had changed color. The little girl looked at the young lady and said that her mother imprinted their powers so that she could live a normal life. Agnes looked at the girl and asked if she had really lost her memories after this situation. The girl said that this was not true at all. Agnes was surprised and did not understand what had happened. Unexpectedly for her, it became very painful. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all because suddenly she found herself in her child's body. The man looked at the girl with fury and asked what was going on. The girl looked at the man confused and frightened, but a moment later he injured her and cut her arm. The man was furious because the girl's wound was not healing early. He shouted that this simply could not be. Agnes was in shock because it was very painful and she wanted it all to stop. The man was furious because he could not understand why her strength was gone. He screamed that he would not allow this to happen. He screamed in rage that this simply could not be the man. Screamed that her power belonged to her. He was very angry and struck her with rage. The young lady fell down. She was in great pain and trembling with fear. The man in turn continued to shout at her with rage. A moment later, he angrily grabbed her by the hair and told her to forget everything that had happened earlier. He screamed that she would live here as a doll until the day her power returned. He looked at her with fury and contempt and said that this was her punishment. The young lady was in shock and cried as she realized what she had been through. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and called her. He extended his hand as he wanted to touch her. The Duke asked in surprise what had happened to her, but the young lady in turn saw only a ghost of the past. She was shaking and crying, and unexpectedly for her eye color changed. The young lady pushed the Duke away in a hurry and ran to the side. The Duke was shocked because he saw her true eyes. The young lady, in turn, ran and screamed at the Duke, not to come near her. She was in shock, she was in great pain and fear. The Duke screamed and ran after her. He shouted at her to be careful, but the young lady did not listen to him and continued running. But suddenly she tripped and fell. The young lady fell into the water and slowly sank to the bottom. Now she realized that she had lost everyone. She thought it was her fault. She was very cold, and she could hardly breathe. She understood that a little more, and everything would end. But suddenly she saw the Duke's eyes. He grabbed her hand. The Duke pulled the young lady out of the lake with lightning speed. He was in shock and called out to her. He looked intently at the young lady and called out her name, but she did not respond. A moment later she looked at him intently and surprised, and finally responded. He looked at her in surprise as he noticed that her eye color had changed again. Some time later, the Duke lit a fire and, looking at the young lady, asked what had happened to her. He was puzzled by the situation and asked if she was okay. The young lady said she was fine and also asked for forgiveness. She said he was soaking wet because of her. The Duke sighed heavily and said that there was nothing to worry about, and the main thing was that she was now safe. The young lady said, puzzled, as her memories suddenly came back to her. She looked at the Duke intently and said that, unfortunately, her memories had not returned to her completely. She sighed heavily and said sadly that when she was little, her house caught fire and her parents who were inside were surrounded by fire. The young lady was shaking with fear. She said she remembered them. Agnes, she said she saw them die. In a trembling voice, she said that she was later caught by someone, and he kept cutting her with a knife over and over again. The Duke was shocked by her story and could not utter a word. The young lady thought about her power for a moment. As she remembered it clearly remembered how her wounds healed themselves. She thought that it was truly a great miracle, but she still did not understand why this happened. Now she knew that her mother had changed her appearance with her mysterious power. The young lady was trembling with fear. She did not understand who she really was. The Duke looked at the young lady with puzzlement and surprise and told her not to push herself so hard. The young lady said that she was very scared and in pain. She looked at the Duke with puzzlement and, with tears in her eyes, asked why this happened. She said that she had to leave, and she ran and then fell into the water. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that unfortunately her memories and reality were mixed together. The young lady was very much frightened and puzzled by the situation. She wondered what else she had forgotten. Agnes wondered if she really was a monster. With lightning speed, the Duke embraced the young lady. He shouted to her that this was not so at all. The Duke told the young lady that she was not a monster at all. He did not want her to think so. He sighed heavily and said that he was finally able to hear her sincere feelings. He said that she unfortunately had to endure a lot of pain. Agnes looked at the Duke with tears in her eyes and, timidly with a trembling voice, asked if she could stay at the estate. The Duke looked tenderly at Agnes and said that of course she could stay. He said with a gentle smile that he would dispel all the sparks that would fly in her direction. He smiled and said that he made her a promise. He said that if she felt insecure, she could turn to him and he would help her. He looked at her with a gentle smile and asked her to smile more often. The Duke smiled and said, looking at the young lady, that as long as they were together, he would certainly protect her. Agnes looked at the Duke with embarrassment. She was very happy and touched by his concern. She looked at the Duke intently and thanked him with a smile. The Duke said that it was time for them to go back. The servants looked at the young lady in surprise as they heard that she had accidentally fallen into the lake. The Duke looked at everyone closely and said that it was true, but the young lady had already managed to dry out a little. The maid looked at her mistress and said that she would heat some water for her right away. She told the young lady to sit closer to the fire now. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her home was now here. The young lady, in turn, was pleasantly touched by his words and was very glad that he cared about her. The butler looked at his master intently and said with a smile that he was very glad that they were all right. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was very good. And he also said that the young lady was gradually regaining her lost memories. The butler smiled and said that this was simply wonderful news. The Duke, in turn, looked at the butler with puzzlement and said that the young lady might be the one he was so intently looking for. He understood that if this was really true, then her parents had died, and during this time she had suffered greatly. He was furious because he knew it was entirely his fault, and the Duke wondered if she would hate him if she knew the truth. He told himself that even if that was the case, who would really protect her this time? The Duke looked at the butler and called him. He told the palace that he had one request. The maid looked at the young lady and wished her good morning with a smile. The maid smiled and told the young lady that the weather was simply wonderful today. Agnes woke up and also wished the maid good morning. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she needed to get ready. The lady was surprised and asked what was planned for today. The maid told the young lady that she was going on a date with the Duke today, so they had prepared everything she needed, and they would also prepare her to look absolutely gorgeous. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what date they were talking about. The maids looked closely at the young lady. They decorated her and also argued among themselves about which color would suit her best. They said blue would suit her hair color and pink would bring out her complexion. The maid smiled at the young lady and said that the blush suited her very well, but perhaps it was too muted. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and said with a smile that she didn't have to try so hard at all. The maids overheard saying that of course they must try, because she was going for a walk with the Duke, so the young lady could rely on them. The young lady, in turn, knew that she could not argue with them, and a moment later she said that she wanted them to help her prepare. After all the preparations, the young lady came to the Duke. She looked at him timidly and asked for forgiveness for keeping him waiting. The Duke froze in place. In surprise, Agnes came closer to the Duke and asked in surprise if she really looked strange. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and said sheepishly that this was not the case at all, and that she simply looked wonderful. The maids, in turn, were very glad that the Duke liked the young lady. Agnes looked at the Duke with an embarrassed smile, as she was pleased to hear a compliment from him. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked where they were going. The Duke smiled and said that they were going to the city. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had been at the estate all this time, and they simply had to go to the city for a change of scenery. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and thanked him. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and a smile and asked if this was her first time in the city. Agnes smiled and said that she was not allowed to leave the estate, and she, in turn, could only dream of such a thing. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who was smiling sweetly, and asked where they were going. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he had not yet decided. She asked if he had any specific reason for coming here. The Duke smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that today they would do what she wanted. He smiled and said that he understood that since he was saying this at the last moment, she might simply be confused. He smiled and said that they could show her some fancy dresses to start with. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that all the outfits looked just great on her, and that was the reason he was buying them. The young lady was surprised. A moment later, they took her measurements to make sure everything fit her size, and the young lady slowly tried on different outfits. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that she did not need anything else, as he had bought her so many things. He smiled and said that in that case, she could say where she would like to go. Gilbert smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that if she didn't tell, they would continue shopping, and the next place would be a jewelry store. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady. He realized that she had become much better at showing her emotions. A moment later, the young lady saw a girl holding a soft toy in her hands. She remembered when she was a little lady, Carla would run around the estate and hold a teddy bear in her hands. A moment later, Lady Carla looked at the maid with puzzlement and anger and asked what she was staring at. She said angrily that her father had bought her a gift. She told the maid not to look at her with such empty eyes. The young lady quietly said that she would like a teddy bear. Gilbert looked at her in surprise, as he had not heard what she said. A moment later, the young lady approached the Duke and said shyly that she would like a teddy bear. The Duke smiled an embarrassed smile and said that at last she had said what she wished. The Duke smiled as he looked at the young lady and asked her if she had enjoyed her walk. Agnes smiled and said that she liked everything and also thanked him for buying her many gifts. The Duke smiled and said that after yesterday he simply couldn't leave her alone. He said that he very much hoped that she no longer felt locked in. He said that it seemed like she felt like she was in a cage while she was locked in the manor. The young lady said that was not the case at all. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he was very happy to live with her until her memories returned. He said he was very happy to be with her until he found her a groom. The young lady in turn said with a smile that she too was very happy to be next to him. Agnes smiled and said that she was very happy about her engagement to him. Gilbert smiled and said that she seemed comfortable enough around him that she could already speak her mind. The young lady in turn really wanted to stay here forever, but she understood that if she said something like that out loud, it would only cause him more trouble and problems. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that he could not even imagine that he would meet him in such a place. The man came closer to the Duke and said that there was something he urgently needed to discuss with him. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she would wait for him here. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he wanted to object, but the young lady in turn said with a smile that she was no longer a child. Gilbert looked sadly at the young lady and told her to be sure to stay here. He looked at her and asked if she could promise him that. The young lady smiled and said that she promised that she would be there on the spot. Agnes understood that the young master needed time to settle all his issues, but a moment later she heard some noise behind her. Turning around, she saw that someone was taking her gift. A moment later, the young men looked at the young lady with a grin and greeted her. They asked if she was sitting there with the teddy bear alone. The young men mocked her and asked with a smirk on their face why she didn't spend time with them. The young lady in turn was very scared. Agnes rushed to one of the young men and asked him to give her back her teddy bear. The young man asked with a grin if she was angry because they took her precious toy. The young man mocked her. He said that it was very cute. The young man caught her by the hand and said that they should not linger in such a place. He said that they should find a more secluded place. Another young man said that they would have more fun than at this tea party. The young lady was in shock. She wanted someone to help her since she herself could not cope with them. A moment later, a young man approached them and furiously told the young men to let the young lady go. The young man stared, but being a young man, he had no intention of retreating. The young man pushed the young lady away and, looking at the young man with a grin, asked who he was. The young people were furious because he dared to lecture them. Agnes was in shock. She understood what the young man could get because of her. She rushed to them and told them to stop. A moment later, the young man looked at the young lady with a smile. Agnes froze in place, as she was surprised the young man looked at the young man and said that the restaurant staff. A moment later, the young man shouted to the restaurant staff that there were hooligans here. The young men in turn were taken aback and froze in place. The young man did not lose his head, and with lightning speed grabbed the young lady by the hand and said that she should run with him. He told Agnes that in such situations, the best solution would be to run. The young men stood frozen as they watched the people running away into the light, furious that they had been made to look like fools. The young man angrily threw a teddy bear after them. The young people, not paying attention to them, ran away in a hurry. Moments later, they managed to escape from their pursuers. The young people stopped behind the bridge and breathed heavily. The young lady in turn looked at the young man and wanted to tell him something, but the young man with the speed of lightning covered her mouth with his palm, and the young lady froze in bewilderment. He came closer to her. The young lady was in shock. She stared at the young man. The young man looked at her and told her to be quiet. Meanwhile, the young people looked around the area with fury. They did not understand where the fugitives had gone. A moment later, the young man said with a smile that he thought their pursuers had already left. Agnes looked at the young man closely and thanked him with a smile. He smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for, since it seemed she was in trouble. She looked at him intently and with a smile introduced herself and said that her name was Agnes. The young man smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she had a cute face and her name suited her very well. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect him to say something like that. The young man smiled and said that his name was Isaac Hagen, and he also asked for forgiveness for leading her so far. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it was not his fault, as he had helped her very much. Meanwhile, the young man began to cough very badly. Agnes was very worried, and looking at the young man, asked if everything was okay with him. Isaac said he was fine, just a little out of breath from running. Agnes looked at him intently and apologized for making him run because of her. The young lady looked intently at her savior and said that she would like to repay him for his help. But a moment later she hesitated as she realized that she had nothing, and she would have to ask the Duke for help in order to repay her savior. The young man looked closely at the young lady as he saw her sad expression. He smiled and asked if she would like to have tea with him at the table where she had been sitting before. A little earlier, the man presented the Duke with all the information from the city. The man sighed heavily and said that it seemed the cult had returned. The Duke, in turn, was puzzled by this information. But looking at the man, he thanked him for telling him both of them. The Duke said that they should immediately prepare and develop a strategy. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that he would certainly continue collecting information. A moment later, another man looked in and asked the Duke if he was still there. The Duke said that it was time for him to leave. The man looked at the Duke intently and said that the thing he had left him earlier had already been fixed. The man smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that now he could return it. He handed the Duke the compass. The Duke looked closely at his thing, and with a smile thanked the man for the excellent work. The man looked at the Duke in surprise, and asked with a smile if the girl was really his fiancée. The Duke, in turn, hesitated a little, and said that this was not at all the case. The Duke walked in a hurry to the meeting place with the young lady. He realized that he had made her wait too long. A moment later he noticed a gift in the bushes and looked at it puzzledly. Suddenly, past memories came flooding back to him when he was in a hurry to look for his girlfriend. He was puzzled and very scared by everything that was happening. With lightning speed, the Duke picked up the teddy bear and looked around excitedly. He realized that something had happened to the young lady. Isaac, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the sweets in the restaurant were very tasty. The young lady was very much agitated, for they returned to the same place, but the Duke was still not there. She knew she had to tell him that she had lost the teddy bear he had given her. Isaac looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she looked worried. He walked up to her and asked if the man she was waiting for looked so scary. Isaac asked with a smile if that man could really harm her. The young lady was shocked by what she heard and said that this was not the case at all. She looked closely at her new friend and said that the man she was waiting for was very kind, and she owed her life to him. The young man was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She smiled and said that at the very first meeting with him, the lady did not have time to finish speaking, as she was interrupted by a new friend. Isaac took the young lady by the hands and said with a smile that she finally smiled at him. Agnes froze in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. The young man looked into her eyes and said with a smile that her smile suited her very well. Agnes froze in place, as memories from her childhood suddenly came flooding back to her after the young man's words. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what had happened. The young lady was puzzled and timidly said that she felt like someone had told her that in the past. Isaac moved closer to her and said with a smile that perhaps they had met before. He smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that as soon as he saw her, he immediately felt something familiar. He said that this is what made him think that they were not meeting for the first time. The young lady in turn froze in place. She was in shock and did not know what to answer. Isaac looked at her closely and said that perhaps he and she had met before. A moment later she heard the Duke's voice. The Duke was furious. He was shouting and calling for the young lady. The young lady looked to the side in surprise and saw the Duke. The Duke grabbed Isaac by the arm, and he looked at him angrily. The Duke looked at the young man intently and told him not to touch the young lady. He was furious, as he did not know who it was in front of him. The young lady puzzled, but looked at the Duke and told him to wait a little, as she wanted to explain everything to him. Isaac looked at the Duke intently and said that he simply could not believe that he had gone away and left behind a lovely lady. The Duke froze in place, in surprise. He was very angry. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke and said that the young man had helped her because some cruel people were trying to take her away somewhere. The Duke was furious. He looked at the young lady and asked what she was talking about. Isaac looked at the Duke with a sharp and angry look and said that he had merely gotten rid of the hooligans who had been bothering the young lady, and that he was now sitting here acting as her bodyguard. Isaac the son looked at the Duke with a grin and said that he could of course pay for his tea. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. He looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness for the rudeness he had shown towards him. The Duke looked at the young man closely and introduced himself and thanked him for protecting the young lady. Isaac looked at the Duke in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, the Duke looked at the young man with a smile and said that he would like to thank him and also asked if he would like to join them for dinner. The young lady looked closely at her teddy bear. She was very happy to have her gift back. The young man looked at the young people with surprise and a smile and said that he would be happy to join them. The young lady thought for a moment about what had happened earlier. She remembered Isaac telling her that perhaps they had met before, but she in turn did not think that this was the case. Isaac looked at them intently and with a smile thanked them for the invitation to such a wonderful dinner. He smiled and said that he had already canceled all plans for the evening. The young lady looked timidly at her savior and asked for forgiveness for having to help her in such a dangerous situation, and also asked for forgiveness for having to cancel all his plans. Isaac smiled as he looked at the young lady and told her not to worry, as it was just a boring meeting with his professor. Agnes looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was studying. Isaac smiled and said that since the Duke was here, he would like to ask permission to reintroduce himself. He smiled and gave his full name and surname, and also said that he was studying at the City Medical Academy. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he was a doctor. Isaac smiled and said that unfortunately, he was not a doctor yet. Isaac looked at the young men with a smile and said that he was the complete opposite of the gloomy Duke who killed his brides. The young lady in turn looked at the young man in surprise. A moment later, Agnes turned her gaze to the Duke, but he did not answer. She felt awkward about the situation. Isaac with a smile said that he still did not expect that the man she was waiting for so much turned out to be the very Duke of Death. The young lady in turn decided to change the subject, and looking at the young man, said that it must not be easy for him to study medicine. She said that it was very amazing. Isaac smiled and said that she still should not adhere to such formalities, carrying her closer and taking her hand. Isaac said that they were the same age, so she could call him by his first name. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing, while the Duke looked at them very angrily. The young man in turn realized that he had made some mistake and removed his hands from the young lady. A moment later, Isaac looked intently at the Duke and said that if he looked at everyone with such a look, then Agnes would not be able to make friends. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young man sighed heavily and said that he had gone out of his way to help the young lady escape from those terrible guys. Isaac looked at the Duke intently and said that, however, he now had to return her to the deadly Duke. He sighed heavily and said that he was very worried about this. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect him to be so outspoken about the Duke, and a moment later she stood up from the table. Agnes looked at the young man and said that he had got it all wrong. Agnes said that Mr. Gilbert was a very kind man. The Duke, in turn, was stunned by this statement. The young lady confused him with her words. Agnes said that the Duke had taken her into town today because she had never left the estate before. Agnes, looking at the Duke, said that she was very happy when she spent time with him. The Duke was very glad to hear such things. Isaac looked at the young men with a frown, but said nothing. After the meal, the young lady looked at her savior and with a smile thanked him for the dinner. A moment later, she thanked him with a smile for helping her escape from the hooligans today. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that it was time for them to leave. Isaac looked at them intently and hurriedly asked them to wait a little. The young man looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and asked if he could visit her at the estate. The young lady stood there in bewilderment, not knowing what to answer. She was surprised that he would say such a thing. Isaac looked closely at the young men and said with a smile that thanks to Agnes's company, he had even become a little accustomed to being in the Duke's company. The young men looked at the young man with bewilderment. The Duke sighed heavily and said that the young lady could do as she pleased. Isaac smiled and said that he was very glad to hear such a thing. A moment later, he said goodbye to them with a smile. The young lady looked at the Duke and thanked him with a smile for everything. A moment later, the Duke hugged the young lady tightly and said that she had thanked him well in his stead. He sighed heavily and said that he was very glad that she was safe now. The young lady looked at him in surprise and called out. She noticed that he was trembling very badly. The Duke said that when he found the teddy bear abandoned in the grass, the ground dropped out from under his feet. He sighed heavily and said he thought he had lost her again. The young lady was surprised because he said that he had lost her again. She did not understand why he was saying something like that. The Duke sighed heavily and said that in this city he was separated from one person, and unfortunately since then, he had not seen her. The young lady, in turn, embraced the Duke and asked if he was talking about his bride. The Duke quietly said that he was. He looked at the young lady with embarrassment. Agnes said with a smile that it seemed that the girl must be very happy because he was so worried about her. Agnes smiled, looking at the Duke, and told him not to worry, as she would not disappear from him. The Duke leaned closer to the young lady and said that she was very strong. Gilbert smiled and said that she had changed a lot lately. The young lady smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that it was all thanks to him. She said she felt like her remaining hours were finally ticking again. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that, when he looked at her, he thought about this. He handed her a beautiful watch and asked if she could keep track of the passing time. The young lady looked in surprise at the watch the Duke had given her. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the watch given to her was given to him by his mother when he was a child, and from that day on he would like to see it on her hand. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback and said that she could not accept such a valuable thing. The Duke smiled and said he wanted her to have them. He said that she thought she had changed because of him, but luckily she had also changed him. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he was incredibly glad to have met her on his life's path. Agnes was shocked and also very happy to hear such a thing from the Duke. She looked at him and thanked him with a smile. The young man walked slowly about his business. He looked at the man and said that the young lady was no longer a soulless doll, as her former character was returning to her. Isaac looked at the man closely and said that sending her to the Duke's lady was still the right decision. Milord Ubel, in turn, was very happy, since everything was going according to his plan. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that overall her result was not bad, and she was doing a very good job. He smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that she was learning very quickly. The young lady was very happy to hear his praise. She smiled and said that it was all because he was a very good teacher. They chatted pleasantly for a while, but the butler said that they had a guest. The Duke said that they were coming now. A moment later, the young people saw Isaac, who greeted them with a beaming smile. Agnes looked at her friend in surprise, as she did not expect to see him. Isaac, with the speed of lightning, rushed to her and said with a smile that he was very glad to see her. The Duke, in turn, looked angrily at the young man. He did not like such closeness at all. Some time later, they were sitting in the garden, drinking tea. Isaac thanked them with a smile for today's invitation. Isaac looked at the Duke and called him with a smile. He looked at the young people and said that it was a great honor for him to be a guest on their estate. He smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that he was very happy to see Agnes again. Isaac smiled and said that he wanted to see her room and also asked if she could show it to him. He smiled and said that it seemed like a bad idea and he wouldn't force her. Isaac smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she could show him around the garden. Agnes looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted them to look around the garden together. The young man looked intently at the young lady and said that he wanted to go with her alone. He said that the Duke kept looking at him with a very frightening expression on his face. The Duke looked at the young man intently and said that formally the young lady was his wife. The young man looked casually at the Duke and said that he was aware that the young lady was only formally his wife. He looked at the Duke with a sharp gaze and said that since the young lady had been sent to him, it was likely that she would soon be killed by the deadly Duke. He smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she had indeed found a new life and spread her wings in the open world. The young man looked at the Duke intently and asked if he was right. Isaac looked at the Duke with a grin and said that if they got too close, it would be difficult to let the young lady go. The young man looked at the Duke with an open grin and asked if he was right. The Duke, in turn, looked at the young man with fury, but said nothing. For a moment, the Duke thought he looked at the young lady intently. A moment later, he said that the young lady was now an important member of the Dedrick's family. Agnes, in turn, was surprised and confused by his words. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that the young lady was the bride of the deadly Duke. Agnes looked at the Duke with soft embarrassment. She was pleased that he said such a thing. The young man looked intently at the young people who looked at each other tenderly. Isaac sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he was the third wheel here. He sighed heavily and said that he thought he could help the young lady who was suffering from amnesia. Agnes looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was shocked and did not understand how he knew about such a thing. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he also attended psychology classes. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that it was not a matter of losing the memories, that they were dormant somewhere in the back of her mind. He said that he had done a little research to find similar records of similar symptoms. He smiled and said that he had found that there were several similar cases in which hypnosis had helped very well. The Duke was perplexed. He looked at the young man with fury and asked if he was really going to experiment on the young lady. The Duke furiously asked the young man if he could imagine what suffering she had been subjected to. Gilbert was furious that the boy was forcing her to open her memories before she was ready. The boy looked at the Duke and said that it was not impossible. Isaac came closer to the young lady and said that the choice was still hers. He smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that one cannot sit on the defensive all the time. If one does not sometimes go on the offensive, then she will never move forward. The young lady frowned for a moment and thought about his words. She looked at her friend intently and said that if there was a chance it would work, then she would like to try. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Isaac looked at the Duke with a smile and asked him to leave them alone. The young man said with a grin that it would be very dangerous if they lost concentration. The Duke looked closely at the young ladies and said that if anything happened, she should call him immediately. The Duke left the room anyway. He was very puzzled and did not want to leave them alone, but still knew that he had no other choice. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she needed to relax. He smiled looking at her and told her to keep looking at the pendant and concentrate on his voice. He smiled and said that they could look for her happy memories. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what had brought her happiness in the past. Having entered into a trance, the young lady said that her parents brought her happiness. She said that she also found happiness in their life together on their estate. She also said that from time to time she saw a boyfriend. She said that they played in the flower field, and then she had a lot of fun with him. The young man looked closely at the young lady and asked what her friend was like. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she did not know what he looked like. She said that she could not remember his face or his name. The young man looked at the young lady with puzzlement and asked if she really couldn't remember anything at all. The young lady in turn said that they had made a promise to each other. Isaac looked at her intently and asked what promise they had made. Closing her eyes, she remembered the promise. A moment later, she said that they had made each other a promise to smile next to each other. The young lady quickly began to continue to tell more about the promise. But Isaac interrupted her and finished the promise for her. He said that they should stay together. Agnes opened her eyes in shock. The young man smiled a radiant smile as he looked at the young lady and said that those were his words. He looked closely at the young lady and slowly helped her sit up. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was sure it was her. A moment later, he hugged her tightly and said that he had been looking for her for a long time. Isaac smiled a tender smile and quietly whispered that she was the girl he had made a promise to. The young lady stood there surprised and stunned, wondering if the young man was really the same boy from her memories. A moment later, the Duke rushed into the room in a hurry as he heard a noise. The Duke froze in place as he saw the young lady in the arms of another man. The Duke was furious because he could not allow anyone else to touch the young lady. But a moment later, the young man thanked the Duke with a smile. The Duke looked at the young man in shock. He did not understand what was happening. The young man smiled and, hugging the young lady, said that they met again, and he helped them because he brought them together. The young man smiled and said that they confirmed it. Thanks to the young lady's memory, he said with a satisfied smile that she was his bride. The young line froze in place from shock. Isaac smiled and said that unfortunately they were separated in childhood, and all this time he was looking only for her. The Duke was shocked and looked angrily at the young man. Isaac looked at the Duke with a smirk and asked if he could return her to him, while he called him the deadly Duke. The young lady was shocked she could not utter a word. Isaac looked at the Duke with a grin and hugged the young lady tighter. He said that he and Agnes had made promises to each other in childhood, and they must definitely get married. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he was deeply imprinted in the young lady's childhood memory. The young lady, in turn, could not believe that the same boy was her new friend. Isaac was wrapped around Agnes like a snake. He said with a feigned smile that he had been looking for her for a long time. Gilbert looked at the young man with fury and said that he was mistaken in his judgment. Agnes, in turn, looked at the Duke in surprise. Gilbert looked at them with a fixed gaze and firmly said that it was not Isaac. The young lady froze in bewilderment and looked intently at the Duke. Gilbert, in turn, froze in place as he realized that he had made a mistake. He knew he couldn't tell her the truth. Isaac looked at the Duke pitifully and asked why he was wrong. Isaac asked the Duke if he had any evidence to refute his words. The Duke was furious, but did not answer. Isaac looked sideways at the young lady with a smirk and told the Duke that he had no proof. Isaac looked at the Duke with a fierce grin and said that he was only interfering because he didn't want him to take Agnes. The young lady looked closely at her new friend and asked him to wait for her. Isaac looked at her in surprise. She said that she and the Duke were not on such terms. Isaac looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he knew everything. Isaac looked closely at the young lady and, taking her face in his hands, told her to listen to him. Carefully, he said that he wanted her to leave with him before the Duke of Death killed her. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she didn't need to marry some stranger. The young lady slowly pulled away from him and said that it was not like that at all. She sighed heavily and said that her memories were still hazy and she did not have enough information to make such a serious decision. She said that for this reason, she would not go anywhere she knew, that when the memories returned, she would decide for herself what she should do. She was no longer going to be someone's puppet. The young man looked at the young lady with a smirk on his face. He smiled and said that he understood her very well. Isaac came closer to her with a fake smile, said that everything was fine, and he would definitely wait for her. He slowly moved closer to her and quietly said that they could finish the session today. Isaac quietly said that the next time they met, he would definitely tell her about her power. The young lady froze in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young man smiled and said that he was all ready. The young lady was in shock. She rushed to him and asked him to wait. The young man smiled and said that they would meet again soon. Isaac glanced sideways at the Duke and said with a grin that he was already forced to take his leave. Isaac, with a fierce grin, told the Duke that if he did not protect Agnes with all his might, then someone might accidentally kidnap her again. The Duke looked at the young man with fury. The Duke in turn was angry but said nothing. The lady was puzzled by the fact that her new friend knew about her power. She realized that he didn't really tell her anything, and only pointed out that he knew about her ability. She thought that maybe it wasn't about healing abilities. The young lady thought for a moment and compared the young man with the boy. From her memories, she knew that they were not at all similar. She thought about it because another situation was bothering her. She remembered the Duke looking at them intently and saying in all seriousness that it wasn't Isaac. She was confused. She didn't understand why he would say such a thing. The young lady looked at the Duke intently, wondering what he knew about her. The Duke glanced sideways at the young lady and asked if she should stay there. He said that the young man could become her fiancé. Gilbert looked away from her and asked if she wanted to follow her. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. She was confused and did not understand why everything turned out this way. She came closer to him and tenderly asked why he looked so unhappy. She looked at him intently and said that she was now engaged to her. The young lady said that she could not leave him anywhere while he had that expression on his face. The Duke looked at the young lady with surprise and confusion and asked why she tried to stop Isaac. He asked if she didn't want to be near him. The young lady was silent for a moment and said nothing. Agnes knew she couldn't ignore the information Isaac had. Agnes, in turn, knew that she needed to talk to the Duke. The Duke looked at her puzzled and asked if there was something she couldn't tell him about. Agnes, taken aback, looked at the Duke and said that that was not the point at all. Agnes knew that now was not the time to talk to him about such things. The Duke was very angry. He said that he understood her and also asked for forgiveness for the interrogation. As he left the room, the Duke said that she was probably very tired after the session and could now rest until dinner. A moment later, the butler saw the gentleman and said that the guest who had left them had given the gentleman a message. The Duke asked in surprise if Isaac had given him something. He looked at the envelope in surprise and saw that it was an invitation. Duke Weston was throwing a ball. Lady Carla, in her joy, called her father. She asked if she had really received an invitation to the ball. The Count smiled, looking at his daughter, and said that their whole family was invited, and this in turn was a wonderful opportunity for her. The Count smiled, looking at his daughter, and said that their meeting could be fateful. The young lady was very happy with the invitation and told her father with a smile on her face that she could not wait for it. The Count, in turn, knew that thanks to that girl, he did not have to die at the hands of the deadly Duke. He knew that now that she was gone, he had a chance to meet a worthy man. The young lady looked intently into the distance, as she was already anticipating their meeting. The Duke, in turn, knew that the young lady was hiding something, and besides, it was somehow connected with Isaac. But he also knew that it was he who was hiding this information from her. He remembered the day when he ran to the estate, which was on fire. The young man looked at the estate in shock He could not understand how this happened. He was in shock and understood that it was entirely his fault. The Duke frowned, for he knew that if the young lady knew that this tragedy was his fault, she would hate him. He remembered how she looked at him tenderly and said that she was now engaged to him and would never leave him. The Duke wondered if she would still speak like that when she knew the whole truth. The maids whispered among themselves in confusion because they saw that the young people were eating separately. They thought that the young people had quarreled, but they knew that their activities were going on just as usual. The maids were puzzled by the reduction in their time together and wondered how much time spouses should spend together. The young lady entered the Duke's office and asked for forgiveness with a smile on her face, as she wanted to talk to him. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened, as he had not expected to see her. The young lady came closer to him and said that the servants had told her that he had called her the Duke. Looked at her in surprise, since this was not at all true. The butler looked at the Duke and said with a smile that the carriage was ready. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise. The Duke asked the butler in bewilderment what was going on. The butler looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that there was a ball at the Duke's that evening, and they had received an invitation from Mr. Isaac. The butler said that they had already informed that they would come and be present at the ball. He looked at the young people and told them to hurry up and get ready. The Duke looked at the butler in surprise and bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke was furious. He looked at the butler and said that this was already going beyond all bounds. The butler looked at his master intently and said that this was not the case, as this invitation was from the Duke, who had been close to the Duke Dedrick's family for many shadows, and as the current Duke, he simply could not miss this celebration without a good reason. The Duke was puzzled. He wanted to object, but nothing came to his mind. He did not want to go to the celebration, since he knew that Isaac would be there, but in turn, he thought that the young lady might want to meet him again. He knew it would be a mistake to limit her circle of friends based on his preferences. The butler looked at his master intently and asked him with a smile if he thought it would be a valuable experience for the lady to attend the ball. The Duke was furious, as he knew he had no reason to refuse this reception. The Duke looked at the young lady and asked if she wanted to go to the event. The young lady in turn understood that she would have the opportunity to meet Isaac, and perhaps she would be able to learn something. The young lady in turn remembered how he said that he would definitely tell her about her own power. She was puzzled because she knew that her parents were suddenly killed, and she herself was kidnapped for the sake of using her power. She sincerely wanted to know what this power consisted of. Agnes was suddenly overcome with memories, and she remembered her friend. She wanted to know if it was really Isaac, the same boy from her memories. She really wanted to find out everything. The young lady looked intently at the Duke and said that she would very much like to attend this celebration. The young lady looked at the Duke with a puzzled expression and asked if he didn't like social events. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he didn't really like such events. The man greeted the Duke with a smile. He was glad that his friend had come after all. Gilbert looked at the Duke intently and greeted him, saying that he was very glad to see him again. The Duke approached the young men with a smile and asked if this was the first time he had brought a girl with him. He really wanted to know who this young lady was. The young lady looked intently at the Duke and with a smile, and according to all the rules of etiquette, greeted him and introduced herself. The Duke smiled, and looking at the young lady, asked if she was the very bride of the deadly Duke. The Duke smiled and told the young lady to be a little careful, as he could take over her soul. The young lady froze in place, as she knew the gentleman was not like that. But a moment later she realized that the Duke had simply discovered that Gilbert was actually a very kind man. The young lady looked at them and said with a smile that it was very dangerous, and for that reason the gentleman was carefully protecting her. The young men looked at the young beautiful lady in surprise, and Gilbert in turn was embarrassed by her radiant smile. The Duke smiled and wished them a pleasant stay. The young lady looked after the young man and said that he seemed to be a very good man. The Duke smiled and said that his friend had very good intentions. A moment later, the young lady saw a man who had blonde hair. She looked at him intently, as she thought it might be her friend. Looking closer, she realized that it was not him. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and said that he did not mind if she went to look for him. The young lady, in turn, saw his change of mood. The Duke sighed heavily and said that she did not need to worry about him. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she was his bride, only in words, and could do as she wished. The Duke said that even if she left with him, it would simply mean that the deadly Duke had killed another bride. The Duke knew his words would work, and she didn't have to stay by his side. He knew it didn't matter where she went or who she was with. He wanted her to be happy. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked why he said that. Turning around, the Duke noticed her intent gaze. The lady came closer to him, as she wanted to explain and tell him everything. But unfortunately, she knew that it was not time yet. A moment later, she looked away from him, for she knew that the gentleman already had someone he wanted to marry. The young lady was very sad to realize this thought, but she knew that they would soon have to part, but she still wanted to be near him until then. A moment later, a young lady approached them and timidly asked for forgiveness. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked in surprise what was the matter. Agnes decided to leave so as not to disturb their conversation. Agnes knew that even if she voiced her selfish desires, it would only cause him unnecessary worry. She knew that she needed to calm down. As she was leaving, she glanced sideways at the young people. She saw that the Duke was having a casual conversation with a sweet and beautiful lady. She felt very hurt. She wondered if he would be like this the day he found his lost bride. The young lady looked intently at the young man and timidly said that she noticed him from afar because he was very handsome and imposing. She smiled a radiant smile and, looking at the Duke, asked if she could ask him to dance. But a moment later, a young lady approached her and told her to stop. The young lady quietly whispered to her friend that she should not communicate with this man. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked why she was saying that. The young lady quietly whispered to her friend that this man was the deadly Duke. The young lady froze in shock. She was very afraid of the man. A moment later, rumors began to spread, and everyone stared at the deadly Duke. They were shocked, as they did not expect such an attractive young man to be the deadly Duke. All the guests present began to whisper. Looking at the Duke, they said that he killed his brides. For a moment, the Duke wilted. The young lady, in turn, was dumbfounded because she had heard rumors about the Duke. She had heard that everyone was saying that he was a murderer. The young lady turned around in a hurry, for she knew that the young Duke was not that kind of person. But a moment later, she accidentally bumped into the young lady and asked for forgiveness in a puzzled manner. Turning around, she clearly saw Madame Carla in front of her and froze in place. The young lady looked at Agnes with contempt and anger. The young lady looked at Agnes with fury. She could not believe that she was seeing her in front of her now. She looked at her with disdain and asked how she was alive, since she should have been dead by now. Agnes was dumbfounded, not knowing what to answer. She timidly began to mumble something under her breath. Carla looked at her with fury and told her to answer immediately why she was in this place. The young lady looked at Lady Carla in horror, and Carla, in turn, screamed at the young lady and told her to immediately explain what was going on. Agnes bowed to Lady Carla and said that she would tell her everything. Now she said that the Duke treated her very well. Carla was shocked by what she heard. Looking at the young lady, she asked if she really meant the deadly Duke. Carla looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked if she really meant to say that the man treated her well. Carla looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if she had run away. The young lady looked at Agnes with a smirk and said that it seemed she was so afraid of death that she ran away from his estate. Carla looked at Agnes closely and said that it seemed like she had been picked up again by someone kind-hearted, like her father. She said with disdain that the young lady was just a pathetic person. Carla came closer to her and said that she couldn't even die for their family, despite everything they had done for her. She said with disdain that the young lady was just a useless doll. Agnes hesitated for a moment and said that she had not run away at all. Carla looked at her angrily and asked if she had just spoken. Carla said that it seemed like the young lady had become quite arrogant. She came closer to her and stepped on her foot, pushing Agnes away. Agnes was in shock as she lost her balance for a moment. A moment later, the young lady fell on the waiter, who was serving drinks, and the room was filled with noise. Everyone present was shocked. They said it was just awful because the young lady knocked over the champagne. Carla looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked why she was standing there. Carla looked at Agnes and shouted angrily at her to clean up immediately. The young lady said she was very sorry. Agnes slowly began to clear away the shards from the floor. All the guests present looked at her with disdain, and Lady Carla in turn mocked her. Carla looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she was nothing but a vile rat, and even if she wore an elegant dress, she would not be able to hide her true nature. Carla said with disdain that crawling on the floor suited her best. The young lady in turn knew that things were very bad now. Agnes knew she had to stand up for herself, but she had failed to do so in front of Lady Carla. She knew that in front of the lady, she was turning into her old self. A moment later, the Duke approached them and, looking angrily at everyone present, asked what was going on. Carla looked intently at the young man and, asking for forgiveness for the noise, said that this situation occurred because of the rudeness of the young lady. The Duke leaned closer to the young lady and said that if she touched the shards with her bare hands, she might cut herself. The young lady in turn looked timidly at the Duke and said in a trembling voice that she had broken the glasses. The Duke came closer to her and asked in surprise who she was now that she was not a servant at all. The young lady in turn was very surprised and happy with the Duke's words. The Duke looked sideways at the waiter with fury and asked what he was doing now. The Duke looked at the waiter with fury and apologized for what his companion had done. But he still said that the young man was a waiter, and he did not think that the waiter should just stand and watch everything that was happening. The waiter was taken aback and shouted that he was very sorry. The waiter shouted in a hurry that he would clean everything up immediately. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and called her tenderly. The Duke looked at her intently and with a gentle smile said that she did not need to apologize. Right away, he told her not to forget that she was his fiancée. The young lady looked at him intently. She was very glad that the Duke said such a thing. Carla looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked if this was the man who picked her up. Carla said that the man must be very strange to do something like that. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked Agnes who she was. Agnes looked sideways at Lady Carla and said she didn't know who she was. Carla looked at Agnes with fury. She couldn't believe that the young lady had said something like that. At the same time, Isaac arrived at the ball. The young man sighed heavily, as he knew that it was already very late and he would be in trouble. He was very curious if his girlfriend had come to this event. He knew that he really needed her. A moment later, he started coughing. He was a little distracted from his state as he remembered the sweet young lady. He knew that she was very sweet, but he in turn could not wait any longer. He wanted to test how real her power was, since he had no choice. Isaac knew he had to follow his own plan. The Count looked closely at the young man and said that if he went into the hall, she would be wary. The Count looked at the young man with a grin and said that he was sure that she would not reject his proposal. The Count said that in any case he could enjoy the ball with her, but a moment later the young man began to cough very violently. The Count looked at the young man with a grin and asked if he had caught a cold. The young man, breathing heavily, said that he simply laughed too much. The Count said that it seemed that the young man had his own circumstances, so he needed to force the girl to wake up soon. Isaac looked closely at the Count and said with a grin that he would definitely achieve this. The young lady in turn knew that she had changed and that she was no longer a servant who constantly lived in fear of the young lady. Carla looked at Agnes with fury. She could not understand how the maid dared to say such a thing in front of her. Carla screamed with fury as she looked at the young lady who served in her house. The young lady looked at the dwarf and said that Agnes Wilfred was already dead. She looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that their puppet was no more. The young lady in her turn was very angry. She looked at Agnes with fury and contempt. Agnes came closer to her and, asking for forgiveness, said that she had to go now. Carla froze in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear or see something like this. Carla, in turn, was watching the young lady closely. She saw that she was smiling, as if she was trying to humiliate her. Carla knew that she had trained the young lady very well, but it seemed that she had forgotten who she served now. Carla knew that she would never forgive her for treating her like that. Carla saw that the young lady looked very happy now, but she wanted to destroy her long-awaited happiness. The young lady froze for a moment, as she realized that Lady Carla was constantly looking at her, and she felt uneasy. Agnes, in turn, wanted to ignore her, since she no longer wanted to see her. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and called her. He said that she must be very tired, and also asked if she wanted to go home. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she would be happy to return. Of course, she was very upset, as she wanted to find her friend and ask him what he knew about her power, but she realized that she would not be able to do this today. A moment later, she saw her friend, who greeted her with a smile. The young man ran to her. In a hurry, he smiled a radiant smile and said that he was very glad to see her, but unfortunately he was late with the speed of lightning. The Duke stood between them and did not allow the young man to embrace his companion. The Duke looked at the young man closely and politely asked him to keep his distance from his own bride. Isaac was furious, as the Duke was ruining his plan. Isaac looked at the Duke with a smirk and said that she was just his temporary bride. Isaac said that the Duke was very diligent in fulfilling his role as the young lady's bodyguard. Lady Carla looked at the young people intently. She was furious and did not understand what was happening between them. Carla knew that the young lady was nothing but a dirty rat who had served them for a long time. She couldn't believe that the young lady had the attention of two men at once. Carla was furious because she saw that the young people were simply attractive. Carla was furious. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She thought it was some kind of mistake. She was furious because she knew she couldn't lose to this upstart. Carla thought it was just some kind of nonsense. The Duke looked at the young man and thanked him for the invitation to the ball. He said that they had a good evening and were already getting ready to go home. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was not at all necessary for her to leave with the Duke. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback and said that if the Duke was leaving, then she would go with him. The young man came closer to the young lady and asked if she remembered that he had said earlier that he knew about her power. He asked if she would like to talk to him alone. The young lady, in turn, knew that this was exactly why she had come to the event. The lady looked at the Duke intently and asked if he could wait for her a little while, as she was due back soon. She knew she had to talk to her friend. The Duke sighed heavily, as he realized that after all the young lady was interested in the young man. The Duke sighed heavily and agreed with her. He said that if she was late, he would go looking for her. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and agreed with a smile. She was glad that he gave her the opportunity to talk to his friend. The Duke looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that he did not at all like to interfere in her conversations with her friends. Isaac looked at the Duke with a grin and asked if he didn't have his own worries. Right now, the Duke looked at the young man with bewilderment and asked what he meant. Isaac smiled and said that the Bonta lady had been looking at him with passion in her eyes the whole time. Lady Carla froze in confusion. Looking at the young people, she did not understand what the young man was talking about. Isaac smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that they should definitely give other girls a chance at love. He pushed her forward and said that they needed to leave quickly. Agnes was in shock. The Duke looked at the young people in surprise and bewilderment. Isaac smiled and said that the Duke did not need to worry, as they would return soon. A moment later, Lady Carla seized the Duke by the sleeve and asked if he would join her in a little conversation, knowing that if she could not win him over to her side, she could corner Agnes. The Duke looked at the young lady intently. He was very angry. The young lady looked at the Duke with a grin and said that she knew the girl he was talking to now. Isaac was pushing the young lady forward in a hurry. Agnes was in shock. She was telling Isaac to stop. Agnes looked at her friend in surprise and said that it was too impolite to leave the ball like that. The young man looked closely at the young lady and asked for forgiveness with a smile. He smiled and said that it would not take long, but that the Duke was too persistent, and it was not easy for him to carry on a conversation in his presence. Isaac walked up to the young lady and said with a smirk that they were finally alone. The young lady was a little uncomfortable with him. Isaac looked at her in surprise and asked what was the matter. Isaac looked at the young lady intently and asked why she continued to avoid him. The young lady in turn looked at him intently but did not answer. A moment later, the young lady looked at the young man intently and yet said that she had been thinking about something for a long time. She looked at him intently and asked how he knew about her memory loss. The young man looked at her in surprise and hesitated. He did not know how to answer the question posed. He timidly said that it seemed to him that she herself told him about it. Agnes sighed heavily and said that it was not so. Isaac looked at her with a smirk. She looked at him intently and said firmly that no one knew about her power. She knew that her mother had told her to keep her power a secret. Besides, she didn't understand much about it. She didn't understand how he knew about such a thing. The young lady looked at him intently and asked how he knew about her strength. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that it seemed she had already remembered everything. The young lady became wary and, looking at the young man, asked who he really was. Isaac smiled as he looked at the young lady and told her not to make such a stern face. He said that she had indeed told him about her power when they were little. The young lady in turn knew that this was not true. Since Isaac was not the boy from her memories, she looked at him intently and asked him to stop lying to her. She looked at him intently and asked why he was telling her such things. She saw that he felt bad. A moment later, the young man fell to his knees in front of the young lady. She looked at him in shock and asked if he was okay. She screamed that she would immediately call someone for help. The young man, in turn, with a grin, wiping the blood from his face, told her to wait and not call anyone. He sighed heavily and said that he often had similar attacks and that everything would soon pass. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not know what to do. She came closer to him and asked if they really visited him that often. The young man sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he had attacks often. Agnes was very much puzzled and agitated. She saw that he had turned very pale. She saw that he was having difficulty breathing and thought he seemed to have a fever. He looked at her in surprise and said that she had previously avoided him. He asked why she was now coming so close to him. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking at her friend, said that she could not turn away from a suffering man. He smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that if she was still going to stay, then they should continue their conversation. The young lady looked at him intently and, sighing heavily, told him to be quiet for a while and not to say anything, as she did not want him to get worse. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady looked at the Duke with a grin and said it was very unfortunate that he had to pick someone like Agnes. She said that unfortunately she did not know how it happened, but she sincerely sympathized with him. The Duke was shocked by the young lady's statement and looked at her with fury. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smirk and said that if he found her difficult to manage, perhaps it would be easier to use her as a servant. The Duke looked at the young lady intently. He was very angry, and he knew that from Agnes's behavior this girl, who was in front of him, was making fun of her. He looked at the young lady angrily and said that it seemed that she knew Agnes very well. Carla said that the young lady was an extremely unpleasant person. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that it seemed that Agnes had been treated extremely cruelly. Up until today, the young lady stood there in bewilderment. The Duke was furious. He looked at her and asked if she knew how Agnes used to live. The young lady froze in place as she began to fear the Duke. Isaac looked closely at the young lady and thanked her for her help. He said that he was already feeling better. The young lady looked at her friend worriedly and said that they should go back inside, as it was warm, and they could get something to drink. The young man smiled and said that he was fine. He looked hard at the young lady and said that she must leave him, as she should return to the Duke after all. The young lady looked hard at her companion and said that she could not do it, as he was not feeling well. Agnes looked at him intently and said that she could not leave him alone. The young man froze in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her, but still he was pleased, and he knew that he had achieved his goal. He looked at her with a feigned smile and said that she was very kind. The young lady looked at him in surprise, but a moment later, her expression changing, she said that she felt as if she was speaking to him sincerely. For the first time, Isaac froze in place. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should still take better care of himself. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that by pretending that everything is fine, he only upsets the people close to him. He was surprised by his task, but looked at her and said that she didn't even know if there were such people in his life. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it made her sad just to think about his country. She said that even if he lied to her, he still said that he wanted to be her friend. She smiled and said that this made her very happy. The young lady looked at her friend and said with a smile that the Duke had also said something similar to her. She said that she did not know if he cared about himself, but thanks to the Duke, she had improved. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she now takes care of herself and lives a more joyful life. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was no longer a puppet. Agnes looked at him in surprise and asked what he was saying. "You are ours." He sighed heavily and said that he would tell her about himself. He sighed heavily and said that he was born with a chronic illness and did not have long to live, but he did not want such a fate at all. He looked at her intently and told the young lady seriously that with her magic, she could change the lives of many people, but because of it, she could lose a lot. He looked at her intently and said that she had already lost her parents, her friends, her memories, and her power. The young lady stared at her friend, seeing and hearing nothing around her, when suddenly the killer behind her raised a dagger and aimed it at her. The young lady in turn was in shock, did not understand what was happening. She suddenly saw her friend, who protected her from the killer. The mercenary looked at the young man in surprise, as he did not understand why he acted in such a way. A moment later, the mercenary disappeared into the darkness. The young lady in turn looked at the young man. In fear, she screamed as she saw that he was wounded. Agnes screamed and called for someone to help. She realized that it was all in vain, as the music was coming from the hall, but she continued to ask for help. Agnes, in turn, was very angry, because she understood that if she just screamed, no one would hear her. She knew that she had to go for help, but she could not do this, because if she stopped pressing on the wound, the bleeding would increase. She was furious, because she knew he could die. She knew she had to save him no matter what. For a moment, the young lady was overcome with memories from the past. Now she realized that she had the same power as her mother. She remembered telling her friend that she would no longer make new acquaintances until she got her power under control. Suddenly, she saw her mother, who was smiling and telling the young lady to try to do as she said. The lady looked at her daughter and asked if she felt warm energy inside her. She pointed to a small defenseless butterfly and told her daughter to try to gently touch it with her power. Agnes, in turn, did everything according to her mother's instructions, and suddenly the butterfly came to life. She was surprised, and at the same time very happy, that she was able to help the defenseless creature. Agnes looked at her mother in surprise, and asked what happened, leaned over looking at her daughter, and said that she had healed her. Madame looked closely at her daughter, and said with a gentle smile that this was where their strength lay. The young lady froze in place, as she now understood everything. A moment later, she was enveloped by the warm energy that was inside her. With the help of her power, she began to heal her friend. The Duke looked at the young lady with fury, and asked if she was a Wilfred. He furiously told the young lady to tell at once about all her bullying of Agnes. The young lady looked at the Duke with surprise and bewilderment, and asked what he was talking about. She hesitated because she did not know what to answer. She was very scared. The young lady looked away from the Duke and said that she was the eldest daughter of the Wilfrid family. She looked at the Duke with fury and said that he seemed to have great faith in the young lady. She screamed that it was she who had suffered most from her appearance in the house. The young lady in turn knew that this was exactly so, since with the arrival of Agnes in her house, her father changed very much. She screamed that her father had taken Agnes in, but she had an ungrateful expression on her face all the time. The young lady was very angry. She screamed that Agnes was just a useless, dirty rat, and she was disgusting. The young lady screamed that they were not bullying her at all, and that it was all a lie. They were only punishing her when necessary. The young lady said with a smirk that Agnes didn't seem to feel anything. The lady shouted that Agnes didn't laugh or cry or feel anything at all because she was just a doll. The Duke looked at the young lady with fury and said that Agnes had become like this because of her. The lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She furiously told him to stop this performance. She looked at the Duke with fury and said that she knew that he was a hopeless aristocrat from the backwoods. She asked if he really wanted to start a quarrel with the daughter of a famous family. The young lady, in turn, was very happy because she saw that she had won, and he seemed to understand everything. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that if she had come to him as a bride, he might have behaved exactly as the rumors said. The young lady was taken aback. She looked at the young man in surprise and bewilderment and asked why she would come to him as a bride. She was shocked and wondered if this man had not simply picked up Agnes. The young lady was shocked, as she knew that Agnes had been sent to the Duke after all. The Duke of Wrath looked at her and said that he didn't like the nickname Deadly Duke, but sometimes he really wanted to get rid of people like her. The young lady was shocked, very scared, and looked at him in surprise, asking if he was really that deadly Duke. The young lady, in turn, slowly walked back and unfortunately tripped and fell. The guests present looked at her in surprise. They did not understand what was happening and wondered if she was drunk. They said that the young lady was behaving inappropriately. The Duke looked angrily at the young lady and said that it would not be difficult to teach her a lesson so that she would never appear before Agnes again. The young lady screamed furiously that her father was close to aristocrats of much higher status than he was, and if he did anything to her, it would be very bad for him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had not intended to do anything at all. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that Agnes had already cut them out of her life. He said that he would only hurt her if he brought up the subject again. He said that they had nothing more to talk about, so he would leave. The young lady was very angry. She didn't understand what it was all about. She was furious and knew that she would never forgive him for the way he made her look like a complete fool. She wanted to make him regret this action. The Duke walked hurriedly through the estate and looked for the young lady. He was puzzled because he realized that she was not there. For a moment he thought that the young lady had left with her friend and would not return to him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not so, since she would not have done that to him. He knew that she was too kind to leave without telling him. He thought that most likely he had not noticed, and she had already returned to the hall. But a moment later, he saw a bright glow. The Duke froze in place as he realized what kind of light it was. He was in shock as he could not believe what he saw. The Duke rose up with lightning speed. He was shocked because he saw the young lady. The Duke stood frozen in place, looking at the young lady who was healing her friend. The Duke was shocked because he could not believe what he was seeing. He saw that she had silver hair and her warm light. He saw her mysterious healing power. He was shocked, but at the same time very glad that it was she who was the girl he had been looking for so long. The lady looked at her son and smiled and told him not to worry, as she was sure she would soon feel better. The man looked at his son closely and said that it was time for his mother to be treated. He asked his son to go and play outside for a while. The young man sat on the bench. He was very puzzled, as he was worried about his mother. A moment later he saw a young, beautiful girl, who looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened. The young lady looked at the boy closely and said that he looked very unhappy. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was sitting there alone. The young man looked away from her and, sighing heavily, said that he was just sitting and waiting for his mother. He said that he was not lonely at all. A moment later, the young lady sat down next to him and asked if it was true. He looked at her in surprise and said that if he was sullen, it would hinder his mother's recovery. He said that it seemed like his mother was in constant pain. He said that he wanted her to get better as quickly as possible. The young lady looked at him with a smile and told him not to worry. She gave him a flower with a smile and said that his mother would definitely get better. Soon the young man looked at the young lady in surprise. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that then he would not be sad anymore. A moment later, he heard his father calling him. The young man looked sideways into the distance and said that he had to go already. The young lady looked at her new friend with a smile and asked if he could keep their meeting a secret, as if he told anyone she would get into trouble. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why this was so, but he still agreed with her. His mother, who was suffering from an incurable disease, suddenly recovered that day, and they were all very happy about her speedy recovery. The young lady looked at her friend closely and said that his mother was already better. She smiled and said that her mother had miraculous powers. The young man looked at her intently and said with a smile that they had never introduced themselves to each other. He smiled and said his name and said that she could call him Gil. He smiled and asked what her name was. The young lady looked at him intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that unfortunately she could not tell him her name. She sighed heavily and said that she had the same power as her mother, so she would not make new acquaintances until she took control of her. The young man looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. The young lady smiled, looking at her new friend, and said that he looked so lonely, and she could not help but come to him. She looked at him intently, and with a smile asked him not to make that face, again smiled, and said that she was very glad that he could smile again. The young man looked at the young lady intently, and asked if he could come to her again. She smiled and said that of course he could do so, but it had to be a secret. From that day on, they became friends and often spent time together in secret from everyone. Gil looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had never been to the city. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she had not gone out into the city, but she would very much like to. The young lady said sadly that her mother told her that it was very dangerous outside. Gil looked at the young lady intently and said that he would certainly take her then. He smiled and said that she didn't need to worry, because no matter what happened, he promised that he would definitely protect her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if this was true. He looked at her intently and said that, of course, it was true. He said he would protect her, not only in the city. He shouted that he would definitely protect her anywhere. A moment later, he knelt down and said that he would protect her always. He said shyly that he always wanted to stay by her side. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted to be with her even when they grew up. The lady smiled, looking at her friend, and said that she also wanted to stay with him always. After some time, the young man finally took the young lady to the city, but he did not yet know that this would be their last meeting. The young people were having a great time. As they arrived at the height of the festival, there were more people than usual. The young lady looked at her friend closely and thanked him with a smile for being able to bring her to the city. After all, she said that she didn't even think that she would have so much fun. The young man smiled and happily said that they could go to another place. But a moment later, he was taken aback as he noticed that his girlfriend was far away. The young man screamed and called her. He screamed that it was very dangerous for them to be separated. A moment later, the young man froze as he saw a man. The man Yu in turn looked intently at the young girl and told her to come to him, as he had been looking for her for a long time. Gil was in shock because he realized that trouble was about to happen. He knew that he couldn't lose his girlfriend. He screamed, but it was all in vain. The man grabbed the young girl's hand with lightning speed, and he told the girl with a grin that he had finally found her. He saw her silver hair and red eyes. He knew without a doubt that she was her mother's daughter. He was very glad that he finally found her. The young lady, in turn, was scared. She looked at the man in surprise. Because she did not know who he was, she screamed for him to let her go. A moment later, her friend managed to wrestle her away from the man. The man froze in shock as the girl was nearby, but the boy prevented him from taking possession of her. Gil grabbed his friend by the hand and shouted for her to run after him. He shouted at her not to turn around under any circumstances. The man looked after them with fury and shouted at them to stop. The young people sighed heavily, but they were still glad to be away from the man. The young man looked intently at his girlfriend and said that they needed to go home, and he would definitely take her back. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and thanked him. She said with a smile that she still shouldn't have let go of his hand. She said that they still should not move away from each other. They slowly walked out of the alley, but unfortunately, they did not notice how a horse was rushing towards them. The young lady froze in place. The young man was in shock. He screamed. A moment later, he pushed his girlfriend away, and she fell with a crash, and he unfortunately was run over by a horse. Gil was confused, as he couldn't move. He didn't understand what had happened at all, but in turn, he hoped that his girlfriend was okay. The young lady, with tears in her eyes, screamed at her friend and asked for forgiveness, saying that she was very sorry. She screamed that it was all her fault. The young man, in turn, knew that everything was not so at all. Since it was he who let her out of the house, he knew that all he wanted was to see her radiant smile. He wondered if he would really die like that in her arms. Agnes in turn screamed that she would not let him die like this. She screamed that she had the same power as her mother. Agnes shouted to him that she would save him no matter what. Before me later, the young man felt her warmth. He looked intently at his girlfriend, as she was very beautiful. When he woke up, he was alone. The young man was puzzled, as all his wounds had disappeared as if by magic. But still he was very excited, as he did not understand where his girlfriend had gone. He was very worried, because he was afraid that she could be kidnapped by a man again. He knew that they could just do nothing, so he rushed around the city looking for the young lady. He thought that she must have just gone home first, but when he came to make sure she was okay, her house was engulfed in flames. The young man froze in place, in front of the burning house. Later, 2 corpses were found in the ashes, but no one knew where the young lady had gone, so he continued searching. The Duke, in turn, really believed that she was still alive. He knew that one day he would find her, and she would be next to him. The young lady looked closely at her friend and sighed with relief. She knew that he was okay now. But a moment later, she collapsed, exhausted, having spent all her strength healing her friend. With lightning speed, the Duke caught the young lady. He smiled, looking at Agnes. He was very glad that she turned out to be the one he had been looking for a long time. He knew that no matter what anyone said, he would never forget her, because he wanted to be with her always, no matter what. The man looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he really had a fiancée. He asked the Duke why he couldn't just let go of the past. The man asked the Duke if the young lady was not good enough for him. The man told the Duke that for the sake of his family, he must marry quickly. But the Duke, in turn, knew that he had sworn an oath to the young lady to protect her always, and he was furious with himself because she had suffered for so long because of his selfish desires. He understood that no matter what she had to continue living, he was glad that he had finally found her. The Duke knew that he would never let her go again. The young man sighed heavily as he woke up and found himself in a medical office. He was confused, as he didn't even know what had happened. But still, he knew that somehow, in some unimaginable way, his wounds had healed. He was glad that his theory was confirmed, and the young lady's strength was real. He knew that his body was proof of it. His plan was to injure the young lady in order to test her healing magic. But to his surprise, he rushed to defend her without thinking. The young man understood that he would be very angry when he found out. After clearing his throat, the young man regretted that the young lady had not been able to heal him from his long illness. He thought that perhaps it was simply impossible. The Count approached the young man and asked him what his plan was. He asked the young man if he was convinced of the young girl's abilities. The young man, in turn, knew that things were very bad. He could not, under any circumstances, allow the Count to find out what had really happened. Isaac looked at the Count and said that the hired killer had escaped right before the attack, although everything had been going smoothly for them before that. Isaac, yawning, said that he must return home immediately and come up with a new strategy. The young man said that he would still like to look at her miraculous power, and he slowly left. The Count, with a grin on his face, looked sideways at the young man and said that he had blood on his shoulder. Isaac was in shock. The young man froze in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The Count looked at the young man with a smirk and asked if she was sure that Agnes did not use her power. Isaac, in turn, understood perfectly well that if he now told the truth about the young lady, she would certainly be captured. He hoped that everything would be fine. He knew that everything had been planned this way. From the very beginning, he understood that he had to tell everything. But a moment later, he remembered her beautiful, radiant smile when she said she was glad he said he wanted to be her friend. The young man froze in place without answering. The Count looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he wanted to say about the young lady. Isaac looked at the Count with a grin and said that he knew everything perfectly well himself. He said that he had an attack right before her eyes. He said the blood was on his collar. It was the one he coughed up. You said you just thought you could cover it up by wiping it off your hand on your shirt. But unfortunately, she noticed he said the young lady was very worried about him. The Count looked at him in surprise and asked if she was just worried. The young man smiled a fake smile and said that this was exactly how it was, but unfortunately, he was unable to convince her to use force. The Count looked at the young man intently and said that since the young lady had left, it meant that he had no reason to stay at this event any longer. Isaac looked at the Count in surprise and asked if he was really leaving. The Count, with a grin on his face, said that his daughter had been bitten by a pet rat, so she was in a bad mood, and he must certainly console her. The young man sighed heavily and said that he would also go home, but a moment later he froze in place as he saw movement. Looking closer, he saw the hired killer who had previously carried out his mission. The man rushed at the young man with rage. He shouted that there could be no mistake, as he was sure that he had stabbed him with a knife. He looked at the young man with rage and asked if the young lady had really healed him. The mercenary looked at the young man in shock and asked if this was really that incredible power. He shouted that the young lady was that same girl from the legend with incredible power, and she was the holy savior of all. The mercenary was in shock. He did not understand why the young man did not tell the master about this. The mercenary rushed to the young man and shouted for him to answer the question. He did not understand why he was silent. The mercenary shouted that he would immediately tell the master everything himself. Isaac gave him an injection with lightning speed, and the mercenary froze in place. The young man looked at the mercenary intently and said that he simply could not allow him to escape and report everything. A moment later, the mercenary fell to the ground. With a crash after the injection, Isaac sighed heavily and said that he too had been an idiot before, since he had crossed a dangerous line. He sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter anymore, since he had now repaid the young lady for saving him. Isaac, in turn, wondered if he would see her again, as he was curious, and he remembered her pleasant words and warm smile with a smile. Several hours later, the young lady finally woke up in the Duke's estate. She was confused and did not understand where she was. The Duke sighed heavily as he looked at the young lady and said that he had brought her home immediately after the dinner party. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a sad look that she was unconscious with her friend on the terrace. The young lady in turn remembered what had actually happened, sighed, and said that it seemed that she was very tired, and therefore he would leave her so that she could rest. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke intently and called him. Collecting her thoughts, she said that she had something that she had been hiding from him. The young lady asked if he could listen to her. Agnes looked closely at the Duke and said that she and her friend were attacked by someone. She said that unfortunately, she did not see who it was. She looked at the Duke intently and said that Isaac had defended her and had been injured in the process, but unfortunately the attacker had managed to escape. The Duke was furious. He said that he should never have agreed and that he should have stayed by her side. The young lady looked at him intently and reassured him. She said that it was not so at all, as she had told him not to follow her. Agnes said that she wanted him to listen to her carefully, as what she was about to say would certainly make him think that she was making up some terrible story. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she had mysterious healing powers. The Duke in turn looked at her intently but said nothing. The young lady hesitated for a moment. She said she wanted to talk to Isaac because he said he had information about it. Agnes hesitated and timidly asked the Duke's forgiveness for not telling him about this earlier. She said that she had made a promise to her mother to keep her power a secret, and besides, she herself knows almost nothing about her power. The Duke sighed heavily and said that now he understood why she had remained silent. The young lady looked at him intently and said that was the main reason why she kept quiet. With tears in her eyes, she said that she just didn't want him to think she was creepy. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had ended up rushing into danger and she was very sorry. With tears in her eyes, she said that she was very sorry that she had caused him so much trouble. A moment later, the Duke came closer to the young lady and called her. She looked at him with a puzzled look. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked why he thought she was creepy. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She was pleasantly surprised that he behaved like that. She looked at him embarrassedly. A moment later, the Duke hugged the young lady tightly. He sighed heavily and said that he was simply jealous of her friend. The Duke, embracing the young lady, said that he did not at all want to see them getting closer and closer to each other, and for this reason he decided to push her away then. The Duke, in turn, was very angry with himself, since he had previously sworn to protect the young lady no matter what. The Duke looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked why she was angry at the ball. The young lady, in her turn, hesitated timidly, not knowing how to answer. But a moment later she said that she was upset by what he said to her. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked how he could have upset her. She looked at him intently and said that she knew that at some point they would have to say goodbye, but until then she wanted to stay close to him. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that this was her wish. The Duke froze in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she really liked to see him smile. The Duke sent a cue, looked at her intently, and smiled again. He knew that this was she, the one he had been looking for so long. Gilbert knew that he had promised her before that no matter what he would always stay by her side and protect her, but he was very sad and annoyed that he could not make his words come true. He looked at her intently and said that he had something to tell her. The Duke said that she had lost her parents and her memories and had gone through a lot of hardships. He looked at her closely and with a sad look said that it was all because of him. The young lady looked at the Duke intently. She was shocked by what he told her. She did not understand what he was even talking about. Without raising his gaze to the young lady, he sighed heavily and said once again that everything that happened was his fault. A moment later, the young lady pulled her hand away. Agnes was silent, not knowing what to answer. The Duke, in turn, realized that he had now lost her forever. A moment later, she came closer to him and, taking his hand, asked him to tell her everything without hiding anything from her. She said that she would certainly accept everything he told her, so she asked him to tell her everything. The Duke froze, as he did not expect such a thing. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and timidly said that the bride he had been looking for so long and carefully all this time was she. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. She looked at the Duke intently, not making a sound. Gil looked after his horse with tenderness and care, but at the same time he remembered his friend, to whom I told him with a smile not to worry about his mother, as she would soon get better. He was puzzled, as all the doctors said that his mother's illness was incurable. A moment later, the young man heard his mother calling him joyfully. He looked to the side and saw his joyful parents. He ran up to his mother in a hurry and asked if she didn't need to rest. Now Madame smiled and said that there was no need for that, since nothing hurt today. The young man looked at his parents intently. He was very happy to hear something like that. He was glad that his friend told him the truth, and his mother felt better. His father looked at his mother with a smile and said that that amazing power really does exist, and he was very glad that they approached the young lady. The young man was very happy and simply could not believe that his mother was going to the city again. The father looked at him intently and said that adults had something to talk about and asked his son if he would mind waiting for them somewhere. Gil came closer to his mother and kissed her tenderly. He said that he would wait for them in the square. Madame smiled, looking at her son, and told him to be careful. The young man was leisurely walking around the city and noticed that many people had gathered at the church. He thought that it was probably time for the service. He thought that he should also go and pray for his mother's health. While standing in line, he accidentally pushed a man. The young man was taken aback and, turning around, asked for forgiveness. The man looked intently at the young man and said that it was his fault. The young man looked intently and in surprise at the painting that the man was holding in his hands. With lightning speed, the man rushed toward the young man and asked if he knew who she was. Gil froze in shock as he remembered the young lady I had asked to keep their meeting a secret. He timidly said he didn't know. A moment later, he saw the man fall to his knees and beg him piteously to tell him everything. The man shouted that his daughter had an incurable disease and that she did not have long to live, and all he could do was hope for a miracle. The young man froze, looking at the man, as he remembered his mother, who also had an incurable disease. He felt sorry for the man, as he understood that he also had a person close to him who was sick. The young man looked at the man intently and said that in the forest outside the city there was a doctor's estate, and his mother had also been told that she was incurable, but now she was healthy. As he was leaving, the young man told the man that he could definitely go there. The man in turn looked at the young man with a grin and thanked him for the information. Gil was in shock because that day he lost his friend due to his own fault. The young men stared at the remains of the estate and whispered they thought that someone must have attacked them, and it seemed that someone wanted to get their power, but they did not understand how this could happen, since their stay here was a secret. The man looked closely at the remains of the estate and said that it meant that someone had told ill-wishers about this place. Gil in turn burst into tears as he realized that he had made a huge mistake, which cost him a lot. The Duke looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and said that it was he. He looked at her intently and, bursting into tears, said that it was his fault that her parents were gone. The young lady in turn looked at him intently and said that she would not forgive him. The Duke said nothing, as he knew that this was how it would be. Agnes, without looking up at the Duke, asked if he really thought she would react that way. She looked at him intently and asked if she really should say that it was all his fault. She pulled herself closer to him and said that he had been going through this alone for a long time. She said that she had indeed suffered a lot. The young lady looked at him intently. After a short pause, she said that after meeting him, her life was filled with colors, and she was very glad that she met him. The Duke looked at her intently because he wanted to object. He knew that it was he who was to blame for all her tragedies. He knew that it was he who had ruined her life and put her to the test. The young lady thought for a moment and looked at the Duke with a smile. She said that she remembered a boy who often played with her. She said that they promised to stay together forever, but she unfortunately could not remember his face. The Duke looked at her intently. He was embarrassed, but did not answer. The young lady pulled him closer to her and said with a smile that she could finally see his face. Agnes said with a smile on her face that it had been him all along. The Duke smiled and said that he had been looking for her for a long time. He said he hoped she had survived and never stopped believing she was alive to this day. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had not forgotten about her in the slightest, as he wanted to meet her again and apologize for what he had done. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he had no need to apologize to her, since the one who took advantage of his kindness was at fault. The Duke looked at her intently and called out. He asked if she could forgive him. Gilbert looked at her timidly and asked if she could stay by his side forever. The young lady smiled, looking at her companion, and said that she wanted to be happy next to him. The Duke, in turn, smiled sheepishly at the young lady in response and said that he was very glad to hear it. A moment later, he pulled her closer to him. The young lady froze in confusion, as she did not know what he wanted from her. The Duke of the Box looked at her. He wanted to tell her something. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with embarrassment and called him timidly. A moment later, he walked away from her and told her to just forget about everything. Moving away from the Duke, said he was very glad to talk to her. Today, the young lady looked after him intently. She was surprised and did not understand his reaction. The Duke told her to have a good rest. Standing in the place of the young lady, she looked after him and also wished him good night. The Duke was in shock, wondering what he was going to do. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that the Duke wanted to kiss her. Agnes looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked why she thought so, since she could not understand his behavior. The maid looked at the young lady with a beautiful smile and said that this was the beginning of a new love. The young lady, in turn, was very surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Some time later, the Duke approached her and asked if she would like to take a walk with him. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with embarrassment, as she did not expect to see him so soon. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked for forgiveness for frightening him. She hastily said that she was fine, and also said that she would get ready immediately. The Duke smiled and said that he would wait for her with Zig. The young lady followed him with her eyes and a smile on her face. She was shocked because she realized that the maid's words had made her very embarrassed in front of the Duke. The young lady looked at the maid intently and thanked her with a smile for the food, as it was very tasty. The maid with a smile wished the young lady a good walk. The maids, in turn, watched the young people from the window. The Southerners said that the chemistry of love was definitely felt between the young people. The maid said with a smile that they had been getting along very well lately, and they had also begun to talk to each other more often before going to bed. They said that the Duke's gaze was very gentle and soft. The maid said that they had not spoken for some time, and she was very worried that they had quarreled, but the other maid said that she was very glad that they had made up. A moment later, the butler came up to them and said with a smile on his face that she had been found. The maids looked at the butler in confusion. The maid came closer to the butler and said that he must understand them correctly, and they were not idle at all, and certainly not gossiping. The butler looked at them intently and with a smile said that the young lady was the very girl that the young master had been looking for so long and carefully all this time. The butler sighed heavily and said that, of course, there were times when he himself persistently recommended the gentleman to settle down and forget about everything. Since then, you see countless brides arrived, and they were all afraid of the deadly Duke. The butler's son said with a smile that all this time the young gentleman had been waiting for the young lady, and fortunately he had waited. The maids looked at the butler in surprise and asked if their young lady was the long-awaited bride of the Duke. They were amazed by this story and also very happy. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked her forgiveness for suddenly dragging her out for a walk. He said that it was all because too much attention made him nervous. The young lady smiled and said that she thought so too. Agnes looked at the Duke and said with a smile that she was still happy to spend time with him. The Duke smiled and said that he was of the same opinion. The Duke, in turn, was a little puzzled, as lately he had been unconsciously tempted to touch the young lady. He understood that however she had not yet fully recovered her memories. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked if she could ask him for a favor. The Duke smiled and said that of course she could do so. She looked at him intently and said that there was one place she wanted to go. A few days later, there was a scream in the estate, the young lady screaming furiously at the maids that they were simply useless. The maids trembled with fear in front of the young lady. They said that they were very sorry and they would make everything right. The young lady, in turn, was very angry since that evening. Everything went downhill. She was furious because she was humiliated in front of everyone, and the maid was smiling happily in front of her. The young lady screamed that she should have died, but they still cared for her. She wanted to destroy them both. The Count looked at his daughter in surprise and said that she seemed to be in a bad mood. The young lady looked at her father and said with fury that the girl had made her experience terrible shame at the event. The Count smiled, looking at his daughter, and said that she had already told him about this many times. He said that she was very poor, since she had suffered a lot. The young lady, in turn, screamed with tears in her eyes that she would never forgive the vile Duke and his dirty rat. She asked her father if they could not use his power to punish them. The Count looked at his daughter intently and said that they would think about it. A moment later, he turned around and said that he was a little busy at the moment, as he had guests, and they would talk later. The young lady froze in bewilderment, as she did not expect this. She did not know who their guests were. The Count entered the room and asked forgiveness for keeping them waiting. He looked at his guests with a grin and said that he was very pleased to see the young lady in good health. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was absolutely sure of her decision. He asked if this place wasn't full of bad memories for her. Agnes looked at him intently and said that he had given it away and that he must know the whole truth. Otherwise, he would not be able to live peacefully any longer. She said she was sure her uncle knew something about her parents' death. A moment later, they were greeted and invited into the estate. The young lady and her companion walked slowly into the guest room. She heard the maids whispering. They were surprised that she was alive. They said that she had to repay the master for his kindness by dying. They were shocked that she returned, despite not having fulfilled her duty. They said that she looked like evil demon. But the young lady, in turn, steadfastly endured their criticism. The Duke came closer to her and asked if she was okay. The young lady was taken aback as she did not expect him to be so close. She smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that everything was okay, as she knew they would all react like that. She looked hard at the Duke and said with a smile that she would just like to watch them discuss her. A moment later, they were led into a nondescript room. The Duke, in turn, courted the young lady. According to all the rules of etiquette, Agnes looked intently at the Duke with a smile on her face. A moment later, the head maid came in and said that she had brought their tea. The Duke looked at the maid in surprise and asked why there was only one cup. The head maid looked at the young people with disdain and said that it was useless to brew tea for someone who had no sense of taste. The Duke was furious and wanted to remove the maid from their path at once. But the young lady restrained the Duke and said with a smile that she smelled a very pleasant aroma. Agnes looked at the maid and asked if it was Lafleur's tea. The head maid froze in shock as it was unexpected to hear something like that. She wondered how such an inconsolable doll as Agnes could distinguish the aroma of tea. The maid thought that the young lady had simply guessed. The Duke sighed heavily and asked the head maid if her master had returned. The head maid said that of course the master was not there. The young lady looked at the maid in bewilderment and asked what she meant. The head maid looked at the young men with disdain and said angrily that they could wait, but she did not say that she would inform the master of their arrival. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and said that they had sent him a letter and arranged a meeting. The head maid looked at the young lady with fury and shouted that a brat like her should know her place, as the master would not waste his precious time on her. The maid looked at Agnes with disdain and said that no matter how long she waited, the master would not come to her. She said that they did not even need to sit there, and they could just leave. The Duke looked at the head maid with fury and shouted, "Did she really think that he would just sit and listen to such things from her?" The young lady in turn looked intently at the Duke and asked him to calm down. The head maid looked at them with disdain, for she saw that the young lady was still the same pitiful doll as she had already begun to cry to the Duke. The young lady looked at the head maid and said that it seemed she didn't know her place. The maid was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from the servants. The young lady looked at the head maid and calmly said that she was keeping her master's guests waiting, insulting them and all without his permission. The young lady looked angrily at the maid and said that by her behavior she was tarnishing the good and honest name of her master. The young lady looked closely at the maid's leg and said that she would tell her again so that she could tell her master that they had arrived. The maid was taken aback and said in a trembling voice that she understood everything and would certainly correct the situation. The Duke sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he had lost his composure a little. Without raising his eyes to the young lady, he said that it was an extremely cruel request on her part to tell him to be silent. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that she just wanted to get a little revenge on the head maid. Meanwhile, the Count was reading the documents closely. He knew that Isaac had been acting very suspiciously at the time, and later he received a letter from the young lady saying that she wanted to meet. He knew that something had definitely happened at that ball. The Count looked at the painting of Agnes's mother with a smirk. He said that she probably wanted to seal her powers properly, but unfortunately for her, he ruined her plans. He remembered how Agnes's mother screamed and asked him if he really wanted to use not only her, but also her daughter. The young lady was screaming at that moment that she would not allow him to do such a thing to her daughter. The Count knew that there was nothing more annoying than a puppet with free will. The Count wanted to awaken the powers of the young lady and become a god that everyone would worship. A moment later, servants entered the Count's presence and said that a young lady had arrived. The maid looked at her master and said that the only reason the girl could return was to demand something from him. The head maid said that the Duke might also be fake. She said that she was a little hesitant about whether she should disturb him. The Count smiled and said that he understood that she was very worried about the family. The maid was very glad that the master understood her. A moment later, the Count struck her with a furious blow, and the maid fell to the ground with a crash. The Count said that he had answered the young lady's letter and invited them to his place, and she had gone and defamed his name. He was furious, and looking sideways at the maid told her to get out of his sight. He said that she would never set foot in their house again. The head maid was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Count looked at his favor and told him to deal with the maid. The Count looked at the Duke intently and with a smile said that he was very pleased to meet her. The Duke said that he was also pleased to meet him. The Count looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it seemed they had recently been to a ball. He asked if the young lady had been present at it. He looked at the young people intently and said that he was very sorry that his daughter had caused them so much trouble. He said that he had already scolded her thoroughly. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that they had come to him today because she needed to ask him something. The young lady looked at the Count intently and said that she was interested in the death of her parents, his younger brother and his wife. The Count looked at the young lady intently and said with a grin that he understood everything. The Count looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it was finally time to talk about them.